thank you very much, everyone, for being here. This exciting, important session on solar geoengineering, perspectives on risks, governance, and political challenges. Apologies that we are starting slightly late, 5 minutes, but New York traffic issues. We, of course, have world leaders here, etc. So lots of very good reasons why we are slightly late. But let me just introduce myself. My name is Aarti Gupta. I'm a professor of global environmental governance and politics at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I'm a convener of this session together with my co-convener, Helene Brugging here. And we are very excited to have the possibility of this session, which explores the latest scientific and policy developments on this contentious topic of solar geoengineering. And what just to very briefly say, we'll hear more about what this is, but efforts to modify incoming sunlight as a way to cool the planet and address some of the impacts of climate change, but very controversial. And the core question is whether solar geoengineering interventions should be part of future climate policy or not. So that's the question we are going to address here. And what's also very exciting is that we have the opportunity to bring together diverse perspectives. This is what everybody says is essential in this space. So we have academics, but also government officials, and we have Indigenous community perspectives, youth perspectives, civil society. So we're very grateful that we can have these diverse perspectives. It's a 4-hour session. So I hope many of you will have the energy and stamina to stick with us for that. But it allows us to have these diverse perspectives there. And we'll consider then how solar geoengineering modification, solar radiation modification might adversely impact implementation of SDGs, for example. That's a core question at the UN Summit of the Future. And also especially those SDGs relating to climate action, but also inequality, inclusive and effective governance. And as you know, you've been following the Pact for the Future negotiations, the role of technologies, their risks, but also their benefits, but also their risks has been a crucial issue in negotiations of that pact. And a reference, in fact, was made to the potential dangers of geoengineering by the Namibian co-chair of the Pact for the Future deliberations in the UN General Assembly yesterday. So we think this is a very timely moment to address these questions of governance, risks, etc. I'd also like to acknowledge the online participants here. I think we have many people joining us online, and a warm welcome to all of you as well. For logistical reasons, we may not be able to accommodate questions from the online participants, but we certainly welcome your presence, your virtual presence. I'd also like to acknowledge a very important support from the Global Challenges Foundation, but also from Heinrich Böll Foundation and Friends of the Earth, helping us organize this session. And just very quickly, the agenda we have, as I said, it's 4 hours, and we will have a mix of keynote speeches and some presentations, but also panel discussions. So it's a mix of those, and I think you have some printed copies of the agenda on the chairs here. So with that, I wouldn't want to waste any more time, but welcome our keynote speaker. We are very, very excited, very honored to have as our keynote speaker, Leanne Sackett, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's the Legal Affairs Manager for Vanuatu, and she leads also the coordination for the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on Climate Change. So that's a very important initiative. And I should also just perhaps mention that the Honorable Ralph Reagan-Vanu, who's the Special Envoy for Climate Change and the Environment and former Minister for Climate Change Adaptation, Energy and Disaster Management, who's listed on our program as giving the keynote, sends his apologies. Travel scheduling prevented him from being here, but we are delighted, absolutely delighted to have Leanne Sackett. She's a very experienced international lawyer. And just very quickly, some background information. She's a lecturer at the University of the South Pacific, holds a diploma in law, master in laws, and master of jurisprudence from the University of Sydney. And she has also been a governance advisor to the Ambrium Island Council of Chiefs in Vanuatu, responsible for developing legal education workshops funded by the World Justice Project. And she's worked in Australia also at community legal centers, working with asylum seekers, stolen generation claims, and also in the Pacific Judicial Development Program at the Federal Court of Australia. So her main areas of interest are public international law and legal theory, and she's at the forefront of this fight on behalf of Vanuatu. So we are very delighted to have you. We are very happy that you made it here despite having been given the wrong address. And thank you so much for being here. And the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's really an honor to be here, stepping in the shoes of our special employee, Ralph Regan-Vanu. If you can believe it, his passport actually went missing with DHL, which is why he couldn't make it over. Visa applications from Vanuatu require that the passports get sent to different countries. And so this is where we're at this week. And I will do my very best to step into his shoes here today.
Just to make sure that you can be heard.
You have to just ask. Yeah, can you hear me online, participants?
We cannot hear very well.
No,
is the mic on? I'm not sure.
Was it on when I was on?
Yeah,
I just hear that.
Yeah, but
Is this any better?
yes,
It is. Okay, perhaps it was just the angle.
Yeah.
And the online participants, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, if it drops out, it seems there's a particular angle that I need to speak at it from. So please throw up your hand if you can't hear me in the back at any point in time. And then I know I've dropped off the microphone. All right, so distinguished guests from the Pacific Islanders, if there are any in the room today or online, and global citizens. I have the great honor of speaking here today on behalf of the government of Vanuatu in the place of our special employee for climate change and the environment, Ralph Regan-Vanu, who unfortunately couldn't make it here to New York this week. He sends his apologies and disappointment in not being able to join this. Although I speak as a government representative, I also stand before you as the voice of the Pacific. Voice for the Pacific, a region on the front lines of climate crisis. Our islands, our homes, and our very way of life are under existential threat from rising seas and intensifying storms. Yet even as we face these brave challenges, we find ourselves confronting a new and potentially more insidious threat: solar geoengineering. Solar geoengineering, or solar radiation modification, proposes to artificially cool the Earth by injecting reflective particles into the stratosphere to block incoming sunlight. On the surface, it may sound like an appealing quick fix to our climate woes. But I'm here to tell you that for Vanuatu, for the Pacific, and for vulnerable nations around the world, solar geoengineering represents an unacceptable risk that we cannot afford to take. Let me be clear, the risks of solar geoengineering are profound and far-reaching. For island nations like Vanuatu, these risks are particularly acute. Our lives and livelihoods are intimately tied to natural systems that could be severely disrupted by solar geoengineering. Consider our agriculture and food security. Pacific Island nations already struggle with food production due to limited arable land, soil salinization from rising seas, and increasingly unpredictable rainfall. Solar geoengineering could dramatically alter regional precipitation patterns, potentially devastating our fragile food systems. Models suggest it could weaken monsoons and disrupt weather patterns across the tropics. For nations that depend on subsistence agriculture and fishing, such changes could be catastrophic. Our marine ecosystems too face grave threats from solar geoengineering. The Great Barrier Reef and coral reefs across the Pacific are already in crisis from warming and acidifying oceans. Dimming the sun will not solve ocean acidification and could create new stresses on marine life adapted to specific light conditions. We cannot risk further damage to the reefs and fisheries that are central to both our economies and our cultural identities, particularly for our Indigenous communities. There are also profound concerns about solar geoengineering's impacts on human health. Sulfur particles, most commonly proposed for injection, are known to damage the ozone layer. This could increase our exposure to harmful UV radiation, a serious health risk in our sun-drenched islands. We have also yet to fully study how these particles might impact air quality and respiratory health if they descend into the lower atmosphere. But perhaps the greatest risk of solar geoengineering for the Pacific is the threat of termination shock. If solar geoengineering were to be suddenly stopped, whether due to unwanted side effects or economic collapse or shifting politics, it could lead to extremely rapid warming. Our islands are already struggling to adapt to gradual climate change. A sudden temperature spike could overwhelm our capacity to cope, leading to widespread ecosystem collapse and rendering our islands uninhabitable. These are not abstract concerns. They strike at the very heart of our right to exist as Pacific peoples and nations. And yet proponents of solar geoengineering argue that these risks are worth taking given the magnitude of the climate crisis. They advocate for investments in research, saying that we need to study all options. To them, I say, we in the Pacific are not your guinea pigs. We have seen this story before. For decades, colonial powers used our islands as testing grounds for our nuclear weapons, leaving a legacy of contamination and health impact that continues to this day. We will not allow ourselves to be subjected to another reckless experiment in planetary engineering. Entertaining solar geoengineering as a climate solution creates a grave moral hazard. It offers high-emitting nations an excuse to delay the rapid emission cuts and economic transformations that are truly necessary to address climate change. It is no coincidence that some of the loudest voices calling for solar geoengineering research come from countries with powerful fossil fuel lobbies. This brings me to a crucial point. The issue of global justice and equity in climate action. Vanuatu, like most Pacific Island nations, has contributed negligently to global greenhouse gas emissions. And yet we find ourselves on the front lines of climate impacts, fighting for our very survival. Now we are being asked to accept the unknown risks of solar geoengineering, a solution that once again puts the interests of major emitters ahead of the most vulnerable. This is fundamentally unjust. It perpetuates a system where the global north continues to exploit the global south, using our lands and our atmosphere as a dumping ground for their pollution and their risky technological fixes. We reject this neo-colonial approach to climate action. Instead, we in Vanuatu believe the only just and effective path forward is to address the root causes of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. We need rapid, deep cuts in fossil fuel use, coupled with massive investment in renewable energy and ecosystem restoration based on respect for Indigenous and human rights. We need a transformation of our global economic system to one that values sustainability and equity over endless growth and exploitation. This is why, at the recent UN Environment Assembly, Vanuatu and Fiji proudly stood with our African sisters and brothers in calling for a global governance mechanism to ensure the non-use of solar geoengineering technologies. We believe such a mechanism is essential to protect vulnerable nations and ecosystems from the risks of unilateral defense. But we are going even further. Vanuatu has proposed an amendment to the Rome Statute that would recognize ecocide as a crime under international law. This would create a legal framework to hold accountable those who cause severe and widespread damage to the environment, whether through reckless emissions or dangerous geoengineering schemes. We have also led the charge to bring climate justice before the world's highest court. In a grassroots initiative that has galvanized our nation, Vanuatu has spearheaded a successful campaign to request an advisory opinion on states' responsibility for climate harm to the International Court of Justice. Importantly, these pending proceedings, Vanuatu is advocating for a ban or non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. We believe such an agreement is necessary to uphold the precautionary principle and protect the world's most vulnerable peoples and ecosystems. Some may say that our position is too extreme, that we are closing the door on potentially useful technologies. But the truly extreme position is to gamble with the future of our planet on unproven high-risk interventions. The truly radical act is to continue business as usual in the face of climate breakdown. What we propose instead is a recommitment to the principles of multilateralism, equity, and environmental stewardship that are the heart of our international legal order. We call for a global effort to rapidly phase out fossil fuels, scale up renewable energy, and protect and restore natural carbon sinks. We demand that the major emitters fulfill their moral and legal obligations to support climate adaptation and compensate for loss and damage in vulnerable nations. This is the path of true climate leadership. It's the path that addresses the root causes of our crisis rather than merely treating the symptoms. It is a path that upholds the rights and dignity of all people, not just those with the technological and economic power to reshape our planet's systems. To the world's richest nations, we understand the allure of technological fixes, but we implore you to resist this temptation and instead redouble your efforts to transform your economies and societies, invest in renewable energy, sustainable transportation, and regenerative agriculture, put a price on carbon that reflects its true cost to our planet and people, and support us in the global south as we build resilience and forge our own sustainable development paths. To Pacific Islanders and other vulnerable peoples around the world, we must stand united in our opposition to solar geoengineering and in support of real climate solutions. Our voices and our lived experiences are powerful. We must continue to bear witness to the impacts of climate change and to champion the rights of nature and future generations. The road ahead is challenging, but in Vanuatu and across the Pacific, we have never shied away from the fight when our survival is at stake. Pacific Islanders are warriors and navigators, intimately attuned to the rhythms of our ocean and skies. We know that the solutions to climate change lie not in blocking out the sun, but in rekindling our connection to nature and each other. Let's move forward not in fear, but in hope and determination. Let us reject the false promises of solar geoengineering and instead build a future grounded in justice, sustainability, and respect for the natural world. Our islands, our ocean, and our planet deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really a very, very inspiring, one of the most inspiring speeches I've heard, and I've heard a lot of people speak about this topic. So thank you so much for sharing that very important view. And we have some time for questions. So about 5 minutes, if we have the. Please go ahead. Please go ahead. And please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much for the presentation. The audio wasn't great down here, but just in terms of introduce myself. My name is Dennis Naughton. I'm a Member of Parliament in Ireland. I'm chair of the Interparliamentary Union Working Group on Science and Technology. The Interparliamentary Union is like the United Nations, where it's where parliaments come together. And my question to you is, in terms of the initiatives that Vanuatu is trying to push regarding getting a global agreement on banning this particular practice, have you been able to gain any momentum outside of the small island states? For example, I've been looking in terms of my own country, Ireland, in terms of the impact of geoengineering here in the United States and the impact it will have in terms of our rainfall in Ireland on the other side of the Atlantic. So these are very profound and very distant impacts that can be had by this. And I think it is important that before any initiative like this was to take place, that you have a proper global analysis without one country potentially going it alone. And I know that in the Middle East, for example, they're doing a lot of research in this area at the moment, and we don't know the implications of it for many other countries around that, where water is already very scarce in terms of, they're looking at it in terms of rainfall and cloud seeding. So my question is, have you had any sign up or pick up from any other countries other than the island states?
Great question. Perhaps not the best person to answer that because I haven't myself been involved, and it's quite a new area and for us to be engaged in. There is some really great potential for this to be explored through the ICJ. It's an area that the advisory committee, it's an area that we're quite concerned about in the proceedings. And as I mentioned during the speech, is something that we're advocating for. We're very much looking at other states might also advocate for these protections and safeguards around solar geoengineering in their submissions as well. I think it's one of those few areas where we can see a lot of support both across the global south and global north on this particular issue. And so it's one of these, so I hope that this is something that we'll see a little bit more, at least in the oral view of the study in the second half of December. But yeah, sorry, I can't expand.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions? I think we will hear a little more about some of the other countries who are pushing for example, a non-use agenda during some of the other presentations. Any other questions? Maybe then I'll ask you if you could tell us a little bit more perhaps about this very important initiative at the ICJ and this request for an advisory opinion on states' responsibility for climate harm, and also, of course, this notion of ecocide. So whatever you're able to tell us, if you could share a little more about the rationale for that and how that's proceeding.
Sure. So I'll speak more to the ICJ advisory opinion, because that's one that I'm very involved in. The ecocide initiative, unfortunately, that's one of my other team members came after it, who should be much better positioned to speak to that. But
Just can you hear at the back?
I'm sorry, I'm obviously speaking very quietly, so I'll try to raise my voice a little bit. And my accent always gets distorted though when I try to start speaking a little bit louder from being a global citizen. So for the ICJ advisory opinion, this was initiated by my former law students at the University of the South Pacific. It was my great honor to have been involved in teaching them when they came up with this mad idea to take us to the International Court of Justice. They lobbied with our government, directly with our special envoy, Alfred Kambanu, who then convinced our government to initiate the request for resolution from the UNGA requesting the ICJ to provide the advisory opinion on the obligations of states in relation to climate change. So there are two parts to the question. One is essentially dealing with the obligations of states, and the second is looking at the legal consequences for failing to fulfill those obligations. It's a very interesting initiative. We've reached the point where the written submissions phase has been completed. So we've had we had 91 submissions made in this round of written statements, which is the largest number of submissions ever made for the ICJ.
Sorry, that's
no problem. And then in the second round of written submissions, there were 62 submissions made. So still the highest number of submissions ever made before the Special Court of Justice. Now we have the oral hearings coming up. The court has announced that the oral hearings will commence on the 2nd of December. And we're hoping that all of the states that participated in the written submissions will join the proceedings. But we're also hoping that other global south or climate vulnerable states that didn't submit written statements will also join the oral hearings. And at the moment, there's quite a few indications that they may. So this is a really positive sign. I think the proceedings are moving in the right direction for a climate justice outcome. And of course, we can't dig into too many details while the proceedings are ongoing. But we're very hopeful that this will lead to something positive. It's likely that the advisory opinion will come out sometime next year.
That's very good to have that straight from somebody who's actually very deeply involved in this matter. So thank you for updating us. Is there any final question? This is an opportunity.
Just one
Yes,
quick comment, sorry,
please.
to that last roundup of the library. An opportunity for states that are particularly interested in this topic to raise during the oral hearing should they decide to join this, the oral proceedings. So particularly for those, I've seen there's a few different representatives from states that haven't joined yet that might be interested in joining for these reasons. Would definitely be most welcome by Vanuatu. It's also
Absolutely. That's a call for strengthened multilateralism and solidarity and engagement. So yes, very much welcome that. So well then, thank you so much for this very important intervention. And so we give an applause to our Maybe I'll just, I think I don't even need a mic. I'm one of these small Indian women with a very loud voice. But anyway, I'll use it regardless. I'd like to pass the baton on to Frank Bierman, Professor Frank Bierman, who's going to chair the next session, which will be some academic presentations on the state of the art. Frank, please.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you so much. I'm using the mic, even though I have an even louder voice. So we are here today about academic perspectives, government perspectives, and stakeholder perspectives. And there will also be ample time for discussions. But now we are starting by setting the stage after this very inspiring keynote, I must say, by 3 academic presentations that will cover at the same time the scientific discussion about solar radiation management, solar geoengineering, and then 1 presentation on governance and 1 presentation will talk about governance and also on the ethical parts. So the first speaker will be a natural scientist, laying out the natural science problematique of solar radiation management. This will be Professor Raymond Pierre-Humbert, who is the early professor of physics at the University of Oxford. He has previously been with the University of Chicago, Princeton, and MIT, an expert of planetary climate systems. He has worked a lot on paleoclimate, on the solar system, the planets, and the climate even of exoplanets, but also on our planet, I believe. And he was the lead author of various chapters of the IPCC assessments and of reports by the US National Research Council. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Geophysical Union, and the Royal Society. He has won a number of very prestigious prizes, including the Royal Society Rumford Medal, and he is hailing today from the islands of Orkney, if I believe correctly, but the internet connection as well. So Ray, you have the floor to lay out the natural science aspects. Could you please take over the slides?
Yes, yes. So if someone can unshare for me, then I can share my screen.
I think, Ray, I think I have to share our screen.
No, you just
No, you-
unshare
you-
and then.
No, if you just unshare your screen, then I can share mine.
This
Good. Okay, here we go. Okay, and let me just get my. There, does the screen look okay? Good.
It's good, it's good. Ray,
That's
you can
good.
go.
Excellent. Excellent. Good. Yes. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to share some thoughts about the way geoengineering, solar geoengineering, not only could be harmful but could pose an extreme existential risk to humanity. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I'm very glad that we have a chance to. I have a chance to present this remotely. Now, first, let's talk about the way what determines the temperature of the Earth, or indeed any other planet. So the Earth receives a certain amount of energy each and every second from the sun, and it has to get rid of that energy, otherwise the Earth would just heat up and heat up and heat up and melt and vaporize. And the way it gets rid of that energy is by radiating heat radiation, infrared, to space. And so the planet has to heat up enough until it radiates to space the amount of energy that it's receiving from the sun. Now, more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reduces the rate at which the Earth radiates heat radiation to space. That gives you warming. That's where global warming comes from. However, if you reflect more solar energy by one means or another, then that has a cooling effect on the planet, but it operates on a different part of the energy budget than carbon dioxide does. And solar energy absorbed in infrared cooling affect the climate in very different ways. For example, solar energy is mostly absorbed at the surface where it drives precipitation. It's unevenly distributed around the globe and in summer versus winter, whereas carbon dioxide's effects are more uniform and global. So solar geoengineering, in essence, tries to compensate for the way we've broken the climate by reducing the cooling to space, by increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It tries to compensate for that by breaking the climate in a different way, by reflecting more sunlight to space so that the length of this arrow, which represents how much absorbed solar radiation we have, is shortened to match the shortened length of the arrow of infrared radiating to space. I'm skipping over some details here, but essentially we've broken the climate one way. And so the proposal of solar geoengineering is to break the climate a different way and hope that that compensates. Now, because these two arrows operate on the climate in very different ways, the climate that you get is a non-analog climate. It's a kind of climate we have never experienced on Earth anytime in the last 4 billion years. And even if you somewhat fix the temperature in a few cities in some parts of the Earth, you're going to mess up the climate in other parts. And so that's why solar geoengineering is really a form of atmospheric colonialism, as Naomi Klein has put it. It's another way for the rich world to impose its will on the rest of the world. Because if it comes to the interests of someone in the developing world versus the interests of oil producers in the Arctic or bankers, investment bankers in New York or whatever, who do you trust? Who do you think is going to actually get to decide what kind of climate we have and who has the worst harms? Now, I'm going to concentrate on a particular kind of solar radiation modification, stratospheric aerosol injection. The stratosphere is the upper part of the atmosphere above where we have the kind of weather that you experience on the ground. It's high up. It's somewhat above where ordinary jet aircraft fly. And the proposal is to inject substances into the stratosphere that form tiny particles that will reflect sunlight back into space. Now, this can certainly reduce the global average temperature, but climate is more than global average temperature. It's seasonal and geographical distribution of temperature, land versus ocean. It's distribution of precipitation, monsoons, all of these complicated things. And it's also things like El Nino. We have no idea really how a world that that is engineered to reduce solar radiation in the face of high carbon dioxide will respond. Now, unfortunately, a flood of money is pouring into solar geoengineering research, mostly from the high-tech and financial tech industries. It's reminiscent of the early days of AI, where there was all sorts of talk about governance and responsible AI. But the minute corporate money started pouring into this, the minute there was the emergence of a profit motive, all notion of governance and responsible development of technology went out the window. And we're still at early days of this right now, but just some of the most alarming things that are happening already is that silverlining.org, which is a pro-solar geoengineering lobbying organization, lobbying NGO, which gets a lot of its money from the high-tech community in Silicon Valley. The Simons Foundation, which got its money from Renaissance Capital, is in their second round of $10 million of annual funding for solar geoengineering research. Even the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, has accepted millions. The number has not been disclosed, but millions from the LAD Climate Fund for solar geoengineering research. I wonder how their grassroots donors would feel about that if they knew about it. Then there's the Degrees Initiative, funded by Open Philanthropy, which is Facebook money, which seeks to entrain developing world scientists into work on solar geoengineering. The Quadrature Climate Foundation, which comes from the Quadrature Hedge Fund, is $40 million of funds into solar geoengineering research, and those funds have gone to University of Exeter, University of Colorado, and more is being dispersed through Silver Lining. And the University of Chicago has dumped massive resources into a climate systems engineering center led by solar geoengineering advocate David Keith. And that's the backing for that came not from the geoscience department, the physical sciences, it came from the economists who seem to think of this as a promising, cheap way out to avoid decarbonization. Now, why are respectable scientists, and there are respectable, well-meaning scientists that are taking a lot of this money, why are respectable scientists starting to take money to do research on this very damaging and dangerous technology? Well, there's there's a legitimate sense of panic among the scientific community who understands very well just how bad the situation is with regard to the climate crisis. And there's this feeling, since we're not making progress on decarbonization, we have to do something. Yes, it's panic time, but solar geoengineering, as I'll make clear, only makes things worse. There is the sense in the scientific community that is starting to take some of this money for research, is that it's just research, but is it really? Much of this research actually fosters the development of deployable technology. And some scientists involved, maybe even most, may have the best of intentions, but once deployable technology is developed, the scientists, no matter how good their intentions, won't have any say in how it is used. And think about Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project, and how the development of nuclear and especially thermonuclear weapons got out of control of Oppenheimer and scientists who wanted to keep some control over these things. So do you trust a technology like solar geoengineering in the hands of Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Elon Musk? I would say no. So here are some solar geoengineering myths. The biggest myth of all is solar geoengineering is just a way to buy time for future decarbonization. The essential bit of physics, climate physics, you need to understand is that carbon dioxide, which is the root cause of global warming, is removed only very slowly from the atmosphere over thousands of years. So any continued emission of carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere like a poison accumulating in the flesh of a fish in polluted water. And that leads to ever increasing warming as long as you're emitting any carbon dioxide. The amount of global heating that we are left with at the time we finally reach zero emissions, that's what we're stuck with for thousands of years. It does not go away even after you stop emitting carbon dioxide. And the more carbon dioxide you emit before you hit net zero emissions, the higher the warming that you're stuck with. So we just have to avoid getting stuck with a completely unacceptable amount of warming. And just as an example of what happens, let's just look at this temperature plot. This is a graph going from the past 20,000 years ago in the depth of the ice age, the temperature, and then this is today, and this is the temperature that the rise that we're embarked on from the rapid emission of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And these different lines correspond to futures where we have emitted different amounts of carbon dioxide before we hit net zero. So this is where we hit, we decarbonize pretty quickly. And then right about here, right about the point where things stop going up, that's where we stop emitting carbon dioxide in these future scenarios. And this goes out to 10,000 AD. And so you can see that the more carbon dioxide you emit before you hit net zero, the higher the temperature is that you've reset for essentially out to 10,000 AD. And in fact, it takes about 100,000 years before the climate really recovers to something like normal. So that is the persistence of the underlying effect of carbon dioxide on climate. Now, on contrast, these particles that you put in the stratosphere to try to cool the planet, they fall out in just a year or two. And so that means, and that's the business of termination shock that leads us to the business of termination shock that the keynote speaker addressed. And so here's this right-hand side is an example of termination shock. So this is the temperature going up in response to increasing carbon dioxide. And then someone decides to deploy solar geoengineering. The global mean temperature goes down. Okay, and they employ more and more solar geoengineering, but then something happens, a war, a famine or something, and in just a matter of a few years, the temperature shoots back up again, all the way to there. The longer you go without decarbonization, the bigger this termination shock. And so, the termination shock risk turns a gradually unfolding catastrophe of climate catastrophe into something rapid that is almost like the rapidly unfolding catastrophe of nuclear warfare. And that leads you to the problem of millennial commitment. You can't just do solar geoengineering for a little bit and then stop. You are committing future generations to maintaining solar geoengineering without fail, essentially forever. Without large-scale carbon dioxide removal, there is no exit strategy from solar geoengineering. It does not buy time for decarbonization. Now, another big solar geoengineering myth is that solar geoengineering is a plan B in case the world fails to bring carbon dioxide emissions to zero. That's exactly the wrong scenario for solar geoengineering, because, as I said, as long as you keep emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it keeps building up. And then you have bigger and bigger pent-up warming. And so you have to do more and more solar geoengineering each and every year in order to offset the increasing effect of the carbon dioxide accumulating in the atmosphere. And then if you have to stop because you're forced into stopping it by disagreements over what kind of climate you get and so forth, the termination shock you get is bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And remember, you have to sustain this solar geoengineering for thousands of years. A lot can happen in thousands of years. Now, I'm getting to the end of my time, but I want to just emphasize that many solar geoengineering proponents say that we'll just develop a way to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that will allow us to stop doing solar geoengineering after a reasonable time. But but carbon dioxide removal from the air is unproven technology. We're doing just a tiny bit of it now. We'll probably need all the carbon dioxide removal we can get just to deal with the small amounts of recalcitrant carbon dioxide emissions from aviation and things that are hard to decarbonize, let alone having something left over to shorten the recovery time from thousands of years down to a matter of a century or decades. So CDR is not going to save us. Okay, it's not an exit strategy. And I think I'm going to skip this, maybe we can come back to it in the discussion, and come right to my conclusion. So why do civilizations collapse, and how does solar geoengineering stack up as an existential risk that could lead to the collapse of world civilizations? Civilizations rarely collapse from a single cause, but a pile-on of vulnerabilities, with collapse triggered by the onset of one or more big catastrophes. The termination shock risk turns the climate crisis from a gradually unfolding catastrophe to one with sudden catastrophic onset, more akin to nuclear war. But existential risk multiplies if termination shock piles on to nuclear war and pandemics. And nuclear war, in fact, has climate catastrophe written into it too, because of the phenomenon of nuclear winter that could cause global famines. Now imagine a nuclear winter following a nuclear war, following by the cessation of solar geoengineering and termination shock. Then we're really into extinction territory for humanity and many of the species that we share our world with. That's not a place to go. So solar geoengineering is the biggest technological dependency that humanity has ever contemplated, and it's one that we have to be locked into for thousands and thousands of years. It imposes a vastly greater technological dependency than anything we have ever done before. And so the question is, when do technological dependencies increase resilience? We've been piling on technological dependencies to try to, in a stopgap, to try to avoid having to deal with root causes of our world problems. And I'd say solar geoengineering is a big brick put on this unstable pile. I don't think it's increasing our resilience. I think it's setting us up for a bigger and bigger and bigger fall. And the only solution is to actually redouble our efforts to decarbonize the world economy and keep the setting of the future climate to as limited amount of warming as we possibly can. And it's not too late to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. Thank you. So much for this very insightful presentation. We thought that we just bundle these three presentations. Afterwards, we have a Q&A session on all the three presentations together. So leading now from the natural sciences to the social sciences, in particular, the science of governance and global governance, and introducing here, who has already introduced herself, Aarti Gupta, Professor of Global Environmental Governance at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. She is an expert on climate governance. She has worked on accountability, questions of equity in global climate governance. She is also a member of the scientific steering committee of the International Earth System Governance Project, a larger research alliance in this field, and has also been a coordinating lead author of the science implementation plan of this international network. And she has also her own larger project of the Netherlands Research Council on climate governance, where she studies the transformative potential of transparency. She's a political scientist and will now present her views on solar geoengineering governance. governance challenges and considerations. Harvey, you have the floor, please.
Really?
Technological challenges on display.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So is this a good volume? I'm not booming too much? Okay, great. Just try to, whoops. Okay. Yes, well, so as Prang said, I'm going to talk about the global governance dimension of solar geoengineering following that state-of-the-art natural science presentation by Ray, which was very helpful in illuminating what this technology is. And basically what I want to address as a core question in my 12 minutes or so is this, the core question here is how could a speculative and highly risky, so of course you see my perspective on solar geoengineering, just in the way I'm framing the question, how could a speculative and highly risky solar geoengineering technology be globally governed in a fair, effective, and stable manner? Can it be so? And if it can, how could it? So that's the question, because, and I want to present 4 propositions about this question. And my focus and the focus of my remarks is really on this planetary scale intervention of sulfate aerosol injection, or SAI, which is one of the prominent solar geoengineering techniques that was also mentioned and explained by Ray. And this is about injecting sulfate aerosol particles into the stratosphere as a way to reflect some incoming sunlight back out into space, really looking for a planetary scale impact. So that's the focus. I have 2 key points of departure before I present these 4 propositions. The first one is, and this is a very, this is important, and that is that governance should not be an afterthought, or it's not a later stage challenge. There's often an assumption here that there are all of these uncertainties, potential unknowabilities around solar geoengineering and how it might work. So we need, so those who call for researching as the solar geoengineering, I'm just going to call it SG just for short. Those who call for researching say, well, let's do the science, let's reduce these uncertainties, and we'll sort out the governance at some stage. Human ingenuity is endless. How difficult could that be? But my claim is that this should be a first order crucial question, because the answer to this question should determine whether we should continue to explore a technology which might then lead to technology development and potential deployment. So the question is, could the use of this technology ever really be governed in a fair, effective, and stable manner? And then this over decades or centuries, as Ray was explaining, and I think it's very important to understand what SAI implementation actually means. And what it means essentially is if we have to do this intervention over decades or centuries, it means flying specially retrofitted aircraft, which don't yet exist, hundreds to thousands of them, 24/7, every day, 24/7, for decades, for centuries, multi-generational flying of aircraft, which are injecting these sulfate aerosol particles into the atmosphere. So that's the nature of the operation. So is that feasible for us to come collectively, globally, to decide about this in our deeply unequal and geopolitically fraught world? That's the question. Because the assumption is that we are going to somehow manage to do this for the greater good of all, for the greater good of all humanity. And I think it's important to ask that question at the same time as we are contemplating research and technology development, not afterwards. The other point of departure is that solar geoengineering governance is often conflated. There are 2 very different challenges here. One is to actually deploy solar geoengineering, SAI, and that's the governance challenge that I was just discussing about governing multi-generational use and deployment of solar geoengineering, this kind of intervention into planetary systems. A very different kind of global governance challenge is to govern towards non-use, to govern towards taking this particular option off the table, not having it as a potential future climate policy option, not having technology development. That is also a global governance challenge, but of a very different nature from the deployment challenge. So with those 2 points of departure, I'd like to just highlight these 4 propositions. The first one is that fair, and this is based on extensive research, legal and political analyses that I have been doing together with a number of collaborators and colleagues. The first proposition is that fair, effective, and stable over decades or centuries, global governance of deployment or use is largely implausible. And I'll just explain why we think so, and or we claim that. And the second proposition then is, if that's largely implausible, then the kind of global governance that we actually urgently need is to work towards non-use or non-technology development and deployment. And the third proposition is, and this is also important to point out, that whatever, we don't have a lot of formal global governance of this speculative technology so far in terms of international rules and obligations, but whatever we do have that's relevant to solar geoengineering is restrictive, and or it's conducive to institutionalizing non-use. And finally, the final proposition is that we can also learn a lot from restrictive or prohibitory international regimes in other areas, non-solar geoengineering related. So with that, I'll just speak a little bit to the first 2 propositions, and just there'll be others speaking to the others as well later today. So the first proposition is this implausibility of fair, effective, and stable global governance of deployment. We have to consider what kind of global governance architectures, relatively weak global institutions that we have today. The United Nations system is very, very crucial. Multilateralism is absolutely crucial. But what is the nature of these institutions? And do they have the kind of enforcement authority and the power to rein in sovereign nation states that would be required to have sort of global decision-making about this? And that too in a very, very structurally unequal world where there is very unequal access to decision-making, to resources, to technologies. So the implausibility has to be seen in this context. Why is global governance of deployment implausible? It's also the nature of the global governance of deployment challenge. So for example, this would require global decisions, shared decisions, agreed understandings about, if we have to do sulfate aerosol injection for a long period of time, we'd have to collectively agree on how much to inject, when to inject, where to inject, when to stop, and what to do about potential adverse consequences, if they can even be attributed to the injection or to this intervention. And these are very complex decisions to come to globally, particularly because the risks and the adverse or other impacts of a solar geoengineering intervention would be very unequally distributed. There are a lot of uncertainties and unknowabilities, but one thing that everybody agrees on is that there will be regionally unequal impacts of any solar geoengineering intervention. So if different regions would have different priorities about temperature or precipitation, how would we collectively agree on this, given our weak institutional architectures that we have? And is it feasible to imagine that those who are in a position, the politically powerful states, say like the United States or others, who are in a position to develop this technology and deploy it in this kind of multi-generational intervention that would be required, would these countries be willing to place their technologies under the control of UN systems? So that's a question, and we think that's unlikely. So if we look at this question of global shared decision-making, what do we have globally? What global governance architectures do we have? We have the UN system. We have the UN General Assembly and other UN bodies, and mostly they operate on the principle of one country, one vote. That essentially gives the United States one vote out of 94. If we were to even imagine other kinds of novel arrangements, say by population, then that would give the US, for example, 4.2% of the vote. The question is, and if you've been following the Pact for the Future discussions, this is a very timely issue. There was an intensive discussion about reforming the international financial architecture. And this was something where the US and others, there was a claim that, we don't want to, there is resistance to discussing this in a one country, one vote UN system. the preferred fora are, say, the World Bank or the IMF, where there is a different decision-making system where there's weighted majority, donors have more say. We have another type of UN body which has a different decision-making system from the one country, one vote, which is the UN Security Council. And again, if you've been following very contentious discussions about reform of this post-World War II institution, which gives 5 countries a veto right, one of them being the small island state of the UK, small percentage of the global population. So this is what we would have. And would that, so the idea that we would be able to come to these kinds of arrangements within a UN system is highly implausible. But what if we were to say, let's forget about a UN mandate? What if a few powerful countries, for the greater good of all, were to do this in a coalition? How would others who were outside of that coalition feel? So would we be envisioning, and Ray pointed to locking in future generations into a solar geoengineering world, would we be envisioning a solar geoengineering arms race where powerful countries, or even those countries who might not be interested in deploying solar geoengineering, might feel a need to develop the capacity in order to have some sort of deterrence effect on others? So do we want to put our resources, our energy, our time, and our attention into that? Or we risk counter geoengineering? So this is, of course, a horror scenario where we would exacerbate geopolitical tensions, because ultimately it wouldn't necessarily be about climate change, it would be about global security. So with that, the conclusion on this, our conclusion here is that deployment cannot be governed in a fair and inclusive manner in our current international political systems, or other alternatives that we might imagine, which are inclusive global political control. Because if it's a planet-altering technology, we should have global political control. But that's implausible, and therefore we face many risks and dangers of going down the path of technology development and potential deployment, because this would require unprecedented global oversight. No models for that exist. We'd essentially need some sort of world government, which is, of course, legitimately out of reach. And that's our pressing problem. So with 2 other concerns around this. So if there's this implausible governance of deployment, we are left with 2 other concerns as well around this. This was very well articulated by Ray, that SAI or other forms of solar geoengineering have partially unknowable, unequally distributed impacts, yet to understand these would require, in essence, planetary scale experimentation. If we really want to know the planetary scale impacts, and that's akin to deployment, that is a very huge and unacceptably risky gamble. Another clear and present danger of keeping SRM on the table today, in the light of these other risks, is that if we continue to contemplate this option as a part of future climate policy, we risk draining the urgency from the need to transition away from fossil fuels and cut emissions. So the question to those who say we might buy time for that is, are we buying time or are we buying delay? Who are we buying time for? We've had a lot of time. So why do we think that this will buy us that time now? With that, I just wanted to point to, therefore, the second proposition, which is that in light of these concerns that we could never govern it globally in a fair, effective, and stable manner, it poses unknowable risks until we've actually tried it at planetary scale, and it risks drawing our attention and resources away from the only thing we know will help us address the climate crisis. What we urgently need is global governance towards non-use. And this is something that, this is an academic initiative, which some of you in the room might be familiar with. And it's an academic initiative by a group of concerned academics calling on political actors, governments, the United Nations, civil society, and other actors to work towards taking this option off the table, a non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. This is a call now that has been signed by more than 500 academics across the globe from 61 countries, endorsed by more than 2,000 civil society groups. And what this initiative calls for, as I said, it calls on governments. It's not scientists deciding. That's absolutely not the way to go in this space. But it's a call on governments, the UN and others, to agree on, for example, no public funding for technology development, no outdoor experimentation, no patenting of planetary altering technologies to be in private hands, and no deployment and no support in international institutions because of all of the risks of this technology. So another thing which we can maybe come back to in the discussion, I don't know how much, probably over time. Yeah, is that there could be many ways in which to realize non-use. And this, I'm happy to discuss this during the discussion. It doesn't just have to be an internationally negotiated treaty. And the other proposition which is going to be addressed by others is that there's actually quite a lot of restrictive global governance which we can build on, including human rights norms, international legal principles. And finally, I just wanted to flag a few recent political developments. So there are legal restrictions, but also political developments. Mexico, for example, has banned experimentation of SAI over its territory. And this is something we'll hear about in the next panel as well. An African ministerial conference decision taken in 2023 calling for a non-use mechanism on solar radiation given severe concerns about risks. We can also learn from other areas, and I'll just leave this here as a study we've done looking at all kinds of other areas where we can learn from where there have been prohibitory regimes developed, weather modification, biological weapons, etc. So with that, I'll conclude by saying that we need to govern towards non-use. The time is now, and that actually we need to focus on what will help us address the climate crisis, which is transitioning away from fossil fuels and global solidarity to address adaptation, loss, and damage. That's where we need to put our time, attention, and resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Adi, for these interventions from the global governance perspective. And now I would like to give the floor to our third speaker in the academic panel, who is already online. It's Professor Chucks Okereke, also political scientist, but he will bring in a justice and ethics perspective as well. Chucks Okereke is a professor of global governance and public policy at the University of Bristol, United Kingdom. And he's also at the same time the director of the Center for Climate and Development at the Alex Opieme Federal University in Udufo, in Nigeria. And he has been in a variety of other universities before, including universities of Reading and Oxford, where he also remains a visiting scholar right now. He's a specialist from a political science perspective, issues of climate justice, corporate climate strategies, the green economy transition in Africa. He has been the lead author for the IPCC in various reports, and leads also a number of initiatives in Africa on climate, green growth for the variety of African countries, including his native Nigeria. So Chucks, you have the floor. You have a presentation, I believe, which you can share. All right, Chucks, we can see your presentation. Wonderful. It is not on the screen. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk on this very crucial subject. I want to focus on the environmental justice implications of contemplating solar geoengineering for Africa. I want to keep it very simple. First, the framing. I want to emphasize the fact that justice has been a major pillar of global climate governance from the outset. The concern that justice principles must be a cornerstone for global environmental governance stems from what I call for asymmetries. The first is asymmetry in contribution and responsibility. Well, all countries alike are keen to solve climate change, and not all countries or continents have contributed equally to the problem. This is not about casting blames, it is just a statement of fact. Second is what we call the asymmetry in impact or harm. Climate change is not felt, the impacts of climate change are not felt by all countries equally. And it just so happens that those continents, like Africa, that have contributed the least are the ones that are bearing the greatest brunt of climate change. We also have the asymmetry in capability. Ray has touched upon it, and Arti also has touched upon it. Countries don't equally have the same level of capability in addressing climate impact. Then also we have the asymmetry in voice. Regions around the world, or countries around the world, don't have the same level of authority or power in making decisions about what to do or what not to do about climate change. If we had time, I could give many examples to illustrate that the way that climate change is governed today, whether in terms of the rules of the carbon market, emission trading, etc., have not been mostly defined or decided by African countries. But the decision-making, which have been informed by sophisticated modeling tools, financial analysis, have come mostly from those that have power and voice in the developed country. And these four asymmetries are underpinned and indeed overlaid by much more broader historical abiding systemic economic injustice that inheres with the colonial history of Africa. And I want to propose that these dimensions of injustices can be found in solar geoengineering contemplation in Africa. First, and Artie touched upon this, I believe that the first foundation of injustice that is going to happen to Africa as a result of contemplating solar geoengineering is that it will distract attention from Africa's finance and investment need. Now, Africa needs about 2.8 trillion US dollars to implement its NDCs from 2020 to 2030. Currently, it receives only about 30 billion. Africa also has a huge financial need. Energy investment needs to double this decade, reaching up to 190 billion annually from 2026 to 2030. According to statistics from the African Development Bank, Africa needs about 170 billion annually to bridge its infrastructural gap. And we need Africa about 28 billion in concessional capital to be able to mobilize up to 90 billion in private investment for clean energy. At the moment, Africa receives a tiny fraction of its total climate finance need. And as Ray showed us, we have millions of dollars that are pouring into geoengineering research, which potentially can distract attention from the urgent financial need that is required to meet this transition away from fossil fuel into cleaner technology in the most vulnerable continent in the world. The second reason is that approaches to geoengineering reinforces what I call a carbon-centric approach to dealing with climate change. Some people have called it, carbon colonialism. But a carbon centricism means that you're focusing on entirely problem of the quantity of carbon in the atmosphere rather than the sort of solution that can allow us to address climate change and also poverty eradication or sustainable development at the same time. I want to remind the audience that right from the onset, it has been agreed that the issue of addressing climate change has to be done in the context of sustainable development. The UNFCCC in 1990 says that responses to climate change should be considered with social and economic development implications, taking into full account the legitimate priority of developing countries for economic growth, for sustainable development and poverty eradication. By focusing narrowly on carbon, the quantity of it is the atmosphere, how you remove it, of course, bearing in mind all the complexities that Raymond has told us, you're avoiding to use much more proven technologies and approaches that can deal with the problem of climate change while also addressing poverty. Let us not forget that we have about 600 million people in Africa that lack access to electricity. And this number actually increased by 4% from 2019 to 2021. In Nigeria alone, we have about a huge amount of people, 200 million people in Nigeria, only about 57 or so have access to electricity. And now you want to be pouring money and effort into injecting some nanoparticles into the atmosphere rather than renewable energy technologies that can actually deal with the problem at the same time tackle poverty. So climate change is just one out of the many sustainable development goals. And so it amounts to injustice to be focusing on carbon when we have proven solutions that can tackle the problem as well as more fundamental issues of poverty. The third point of injustice is that this risky technology will reinforce technology power imbalance. Ray talked about it briefly. Artie also talked about it. What we see evolving now in the landscape of global climate governance is what some of us have described as a race to from the West to acquire enough technology to be able to sell these technologies to poor countries in what we call green division of labor. This green technology division of labor will result in a situation where the West will consolidate their hold on technology and they will sell this to poor Africans that lack the capability to develop innovative solutions, the scale of which we are contemplating in geoengineering. At the time that Africans are struggling with meeting day-to-day needs and solving the problem of fiscal crisis, economic, financial debt, where would they find the money to be able to pay for this technology? When they can't even at the moment domesticate, receive enough diffusion of technology, of lower level technologies like solar panel. So more kind of quirky, sophisticated geoengineering technology is going to exacerbate this technology imbalance that currently exists and force African governments to sell their land to be able to afford these technologies if sufficiently developed. Because you can't expect after Silicon Valleys have poured money on it to give it on the cheap to Africa. When people were dying on the streets during COVID, we had the West that were holding firm to their technologies for COVID. And this is also what is going to happen in the theoretical event that we have some sophisticated technology firms in the US that have access to this. It won't come cheap to Africa. The next area is that this solution will likely undercut multilateralism and for that deny voice to Africa. Again, Artie has talked upon it. The ungovernability, if you like, of solar geoengineering will lead to few powerful countries having to make the decision. And if it turns out that few select, anointed, privileged, powerful countries make the decision, it is entirely likely to imagine that it is the poor countries that are bearing the brunt of climate impact that the voices will be denied in making crucial decisions. Even if you imagine a situation where African voices are accommodated, how about the voices of the indigenous people and all other local populations that are eventually going to have to carry the risk associated with this unproven technology? And this leads to the problem of accountability. Many years ago, we had rich countries that were shipping their toxic waste and labeling it aid, official development assistance, and other kind of phony labels. And they were landing in African shores. And African government, because they lack the capability and the right regulatory system to test this, were admitting these drums of toxic chemicals, and some of them were eventually exploding at the backyard of communities, killing many innocent people. Today, we also have huge export of electronic waste that are arriving in Africa and causing massive amount of deaths and pollution. And Africa has not shown that they have the capability to bring these external actors to book. The same thing will happen, very likely, if we're able to, if we permit this risky testing or testing of this risky technology. Africans will not be able to have the ability to bring those that are responsible for this risk to book if anything happens. And again, the keynote speaker talked about it, that when we think about climate change, we should be thinking about systemic change, not just carbon. What brought me into climate research is that I saw an opportunity to leverage on the need to address climate change, to address the broader issue of structural injustice, eliminate poverty in Africa. And it just is the case that this solar geoengineering approach runs counter to everything that many Africans think should be the way to solve this problem. And as I have demonstrated, is going to exacerbate the issue of injustice along those lines. So I strongly commend these panelists and this session, and I would urge everyone to join forces. It is so, I'm not surprised that African countries have tendered a motion rejecting it. And so I don't understand why people are pushing us that we should consider it. This is another example of, patrimonial approach to a climate solution, where some people are telling us that they know, they think they know better what is good for us. And that is surely very reprehensible and must be condemned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques. We will hear about the African governmental position also after the break. You have a few minutes left for questions. The floor is open. For any questions for any of the three speakers. Yes, please introduce yourself,
Yes.
your organization.
Good. Need a mic or just loud?
I think you have the strong voice.
Yes.
You might want to talk.
Matthias Honecker with the Center for Future Generations based in Brussels. I've got a question perhaps to Arti or anyone really. We have identified transparency and monitoring as two key areas in which we believe, make progress, no matter our predisposition to the potential future use or non-use of SRM. Do you have any views as to whether and how we might make progress on, for example, transparency?
Thanks a lot, Matthias. Nadia. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, thanks. No, I think, of course, my other research hat is precisely a research project on transparency, accountability. So I think, transparency is one of those things. It's apple pie and motherhood. Who could be against transparency? But it's a very good thing. It's a very important thing. And in this space, of course, not to be facetious, we absolutely need to know who's doing what. So if that's what you mean, we need research, we need funding transparency, we need research transparency, and the question is how to secure that, how to ensure that. And that is something that people on all sides of the debate should be. So we are in complete agreement there. I think we need to, there was a discussion, as you know, I think in February at the United Nations Environment Assembly, there was this call for, let's have a process by which we can enhance transparency through a repository of information about SRM, but it also shows how very, very contentious this issue is and how there's an environment of mistrust around all kinds of information related to solar geoengineering, so whose information is credible, who is allowed to submit what kind of information where, what should be made transparent, how broad should the remit of transparency be, etc. So I think the contestations play out also in the realm of transparency, but of course it's, knowledge is power, etc. So knowing is very important. Yes.
So much
I'd like to add something to that. Do we have time? Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so one of the alarming things about so much private capital, private foundation money going into this subject is that there aren't really any transparency requirements. They're only subject to whatever disclosure requirements they decide to impose on themselves. But even if you consider the Harvard Initiative, which nominally had an independent governing board to pass judgment. Harvard tried to do its SCOPEX experiment in Sapmi, what some people call, what the outside world sometimes calls Lapland, around Kiruna, by a private deal with the Swedish Space Agency without engaging the local indigenous people, Swedish civil society, or the Swedish environment. That transparency could fail despite Harvard's having nominally set up some kind of advisory panel to catch this sort of thing, and that the experiment was only stopped once civil society was mobilized to object to it. That's an example of just how far we're failing on transparency. And some of these fly-by-night outfits like Make Sunsets and so forth, and new initiatives coming in through all this venture capital funding, that they have even less of a pretense at transparency than the Harvard effort was. So we do have a big problem with transparency.
Can I add one point?
Please.
I just wanted to, I think that's an excellent point, and I think, and it's very important that everybody's committed to transparency, right? Especially those who are engaging in research. But you might have seen this New York Times profile on David Keith and the Scopus experiment that Raymond was talking about. And there, the reporter asked him, what's your lesson from how Scopus worked out? And he said, well, my lesson is next time I'll be less transparent. So I think that's a little bit disturbing.
The reference to David Keith is a famous SIM researcher, specifically for those who are not from the field. Thank you. Please. You have the floor.
My name is Spencer Adler. I'm with Climate Briefing, and I have one comment about, I think, for me, what's been the strongest argument that's topic that's been presented, which is that no amount of solar geoengineering, no matter how well executed, can possibly affect or help to cure ocean acidification. There is no theory even that connects those two. The oceans are clearly on the brink of collapse. I have, though, some numbers that I was hoping, Ray, you might tell me if any of these numbers sound off to you. The way I think of it is there are over 1 trillion tons of excess CO2 up in the atmosphere, over 1,000 gigatons. And we're making that worse every year by 35 gigatons, 35 billion tons. And even the best ecosystem restoration plans, the most ambitious ones, seem to aim for a single-digit gigatons, if that, per year of extra drawdown every year that we might get if we use all the available extra real estate. And yet the CDR people, as you pointed out a lot, but among the things about the CDR world that's a little noteworthy is that even their most ambitious plans are for 1 gigaton a year, maybe in 20, 25 years of drawdown. So we've clearly got a real problem, and the solar geo people seem to point to the fact that we have 100 million tons of sulfur dioxide pollution we're putting out every year here at Earth level, and that Mount Pinatubo put 17 million tons up into the stratosphere. And so they talk about, and that cooled the Earth by 0.5 degree Celsius for 2 years or so. And so they talk about kind of matching that with around 10 million tons a year of sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere. So I'll stop there. That's my kind of list of numbers that I'm hoping maybe you could point out what of those numbers are off. Thank you for your work.
Great.
Actually, your numbers on the limited scope for carbon dioxide removal, so-called air capture, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, they're pretty much on the mark. And a few of the numbers you kind of mixed up the accounting of how much carbon dioxide, which is the weight of carbon dioxide versus the weight of carbon in carbon dioxide. Often when we talk about the accounting of how much carbon we've dumped into the system, we just count the carbon in carbon dioxide because the oxygen just came from the air. The carbon is what comes from fossil fuels and goes into new stuff. And so we're closing in on almost 1 trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere. And what has been proposed as a need for air capture is about 1 gigaton of carbon, 1 billion metric tons of carbon to be sucked out. And that's a real stretch. That requires scaling up the current air capture by more than a factor of 1,000. And a lot of the air capture that's being contemplated right now is going to be used to produce more oil by tertiary oil recovery. So it doesn't even take carbon out of the atmosphere in the net. And so we'll need, it's already a stretch to get to 1 gigaton. And you probably need that, just as I said, to sop up the recalcitrant carbon dioxide emissions. I think that the natural solutions, the land solutions are not likely to even get close to 1 gigaton. And so if you think about it, if we put 1 trillion extra tons of carbon in the atmosphere, even if you have an excess capacity of sucking it out at 1 gigaton per year, that still takes 1,000 years to get rid of that extra 1 trillion tons you put in the atmosphere ocean system. Now, I think we're probably running out of time, so I won't address the sulfur dioxide thing. But the main thing I would emphasize on the sulfur dioxide is that Pinatubo is kind of a one-off, but where the solar geoengineering people are talking about deliberate human creation of something like a Pinatubo going off every year forever.
Thank you. We started a little bit later, so maybe one question I can accept. On that note, I think we have a break, but this day we have after. So this is the end of the academic session. So we retire all the professors, and after the break, we will continue with governments and then also with stakeholder involvement. So please stay on. We have a break until 4 o'clock. We have agreed that there should be coffee outside. I haven't checked myself, but I always believe in the trustworthiness of this corporation here. So please come back at 4 o'clock. Thank you so much. And thanks a lot for the speakers again. And also for our for your holiday in Orkney and Chucks. Enjoy wherever you are. Good. Thank you so much.
Oh, God, yes. Right next to his bowl. And if you didn't get that, like, was like, wait till we were like, as if you could knock it over, and then if you didn't, he would not. But he would wait, oh, like, he was.
Okay. Yeah. Well, welcome back, folks. Hopefully you had a little bit of sustenance, some refreshment. I see some cookies, so that's something. And we have now a very exciting next panel, very, very important, because of course academics can continue to speak to each other. But what's very important also is to hear from, what's happening in the government and policy space in the United Nations. So that's what we have now. We have 3 speakers in this next panel, and I'll introduce each one. We're very, very happy that all of them, 2 of them are online, and we have our 3rd speaker here. So first off, we have Hiba Kaibado Ismail Thani, and she is the 3rd counselor, the Djibouti Embassy in Kenya. And she's from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the Republic of Djibouti. And also very important, Ms. Thani was actually the lead negotiator for the African group of countries speaking at the United Nations Environment Assembly discussion on the SRM resolution in February. So she's here to offer us her very important perspective on what the position of the African group is. So I hope Hiba is with us. I'd like to hand her the floor first, and she will make a 10-minute presentation, and then we'll have our 2 other speakers, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion, a Q&A. And she'll speak about African leadership and calling for non-use mechanism on solar geoengineering and some key policy developments. Hiba, welcome. Many apologies that it's very, very late at night for you. We are very grateful that you're staying up for this important cause. So Hiba, over to you. I hope you have a strong cup of coffee with you.
Thank you, Arti. I did have a lot of coffee in my system. I hope I'm audible enough. Hello?
Yes, more audible.
Yes, you are audible. We're just trying to get to you on this big screen. We just, that would be best, otherwise it's... Oh, perfect. So now we can see you well, Hiba. The floor is yours, yeah.
Thank you, Arti, and thank you all for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this important discussion on solar geoengineering. Even though I would have preferred to be there physically, I absolutely regret and not being able to be there with you today, but I appreciate the platform you've provided to explore the complexities and opportunities presented by solar geoengineering. And the previous speakers were set the tone properly and made us understand scientifically and academically the dangers of the technology. It's as a representative of Djibouti, it was an honor for me to be the lead negotiator for Africa and advocate for our shared position as Africa during the negotiations on this crucial resolution presented during UNGA79. So for the purpose of this presentation, I will take you through the AMSEN decision on SRM, the UNEA negotiations, and finally conclude with the way forward. So the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment called AMSEN passed a decision on August 2023 during its 19th session, the decision 19/5, and decided inter alia to express concerns with the promotion of technologies, particularly solar radiation mediation, and to call for a global governance mechanism for non-use of solar radiation management. African ministers, through this decision, have seen the dangers of this technology, as well as it being one of the riskiest and most controversial technologies conceived, and that it would pose severe and even existential risks to humanity, but especially to Africa with its special circumstances towards the current adversities to climate change already. They expressed it through this decision. It also aligns with the proposal of the establishment of an international solar geoengineering non-use agreement. And by advocating for a non-use agreement, countries in Africa and the global South would seek to promote precaution, transparency, democratic decision-making, and international cooperation in addressing climate change challenges. This call underscores the importance of inclusive and restrictive governance of the technology and solidarity among nations in shaping a responsible approach to geoengineering research and policy that effectively ensures these dangerous technologies are not advanced or deployed. As I think Artie had mentioned earlier, the different approaches to have a proper governance, for us, the most viable one would be the non-use agreement. During the UNEA negotiations, the AMSEN decision was not a coincidence. Indeed, it came at the right time, since in March 2024, a resolution was tabled by Switzerland during the 6th United Nations Environmental Assembly on solar radiation modification. The resolution's main objectives were to establish a scientific experts group on solar radiation modification to discuss and examine the technology. B, request the ED of UNEP to prepare a report to inform the discussions of the group, setting out 1, the criteria and approaches that define solar radiation modification technologies, the state of the science, including existing research frameworks, challenges and gaps, a cost-benefit analysis of the use and non-use of the technology, the actors and state of activities with regard to development, application, deployment, and control of solar radiation modification technologies, the current existing knowledge of potential impacts, including risks, benefits, and uncertainties with regard to each solar radiation modification technology. Ethical considerations, including moral hazards and adverse lock-in effects. And finally, it also put some recommendations for further work. The draft resolution also included that the scientific expert group would include experts with relevant technical expertise from member states. This posed a problem for Africa. Indeed, our argument was that we don't have sufficient scientific experts with such expertise that could effectively take part in the discussions, as well as setting a precedent to establish such an expert group would enable efforts towards the normalization of SRM. The draft resolution also made oblique reference to decisions of the CBD, but did not acknowledge that there is in fact a de facto moratorium in place since 2010, and which was reaffirmed in 2016, and a whole body of research and assessment that had taken place as part of getting to this decision. As such, it inadvertently or otherwise risked undermining these important precautionary decisions. So the African position during UNEA 6 was that we believed that the technology posed severe and maybe even existential risks to Africa and to the world, hence the decision 19/5. The group was of the view that the debate around SRM was a way to deflect responsibility for the fight against climate change from the humans who are responsible for the change in our climate. Indeed, the idea that solar radiation modification can help fix the climate crisis comes from the same mindset that got us into the crisis. Climate change is a political and social problem that cannot be solved with a technological fix. We had reiterated our commitment within the UNFCCC and the implementation of the Paris Agreement through our nationally determined contributions to keep the temperature increase in this century within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Therefore, giving room to such debate is considered that it would distract our collective effort towards our goal, as we've seen and as has been mentioned by, I think, Professor Chikwere, I'm not sure, Okwere. We also argued that the many uncertainties posed by SRM, including its impact on the environment and on human health, and the absence of evidence of its safety and of a global consensus on its acceptability, was a great risk to avoid and call to uphold the precautionary principle. It's important to emphasize that SRM cannot be tested for its intended impact on the climate without large-scale deployment, by which time any harmful impacts would be locked in. Treating Earth and people as a test lab is in a highly risky experiment. Having voiced that, our position during the negotiations were to limit UNEP to gather information on SRM that would feed into the discussion, set up a repository of the data collected accessible to all, and not draft a report with recommendations. This is key because one of the arguments made by proponents of SRM is that we need more research, when in fact, as other speakers have made clear, there is already a substantial body of research available that shows that the inherent risks of SRM and that there are clear limits to what further research can demonstrate without moving to deployment, hence the need to make the information that already exists more readily available, particularly to Global South governments to facilitate understanding. To set up an open-ended consultative group that would discuss the information gathered by UNEP, and the discussions not be limited to science-based research, but also called for a more transdisciplinary approach of information collection, including science, environment, security, and geopolitical aspects, including its negative impacts, and not discuss and give room to the positive or benefits of the technology. And last but not least, includes in the PPs a call for the establishment of a solar geoengineering non-use agreement. It's also good to recognize the support of some Pacific countries, such as Vanuatu and Fiji, and thank you to the representative of Vanuatu who's in the room, as well as Colombia, that joined unequivocally to the call for the establishment of a non-use agreement during the negotiation. Mexico was also aligned with our position from the start, and the EU also came to support our position. For Mexico, we also supported their position in the sense that their territorial integrity was violated, and the same could happen or potentially happen to any country on the African continent. Therefore, it was a no-brainer to join forces in that sense. In short, it truly helped in having support from outside the continent. What we saw at UNEA6 was global South leadership on non-use and support from the EU from an approach that would not legitimize SRM. And we need to build on that and work towards a global majority for non-use. So as a way forward, we were thinking of having a better study on where the finance is coming from for the push of the technology. A lot of them has been put forward earlier, but we need a more thorough study on the finances of where the technology is being developed. And the operative paragraph on the repository idea during the negotiation was to highlight the fact that we needed access to information and enable nations to reinforce and uphold the CBD decisions towards a non-use agreement. Even though the resolution was ultimately withdrawn, this need for access to information is still important. CBD decisions also call for governments to share such information, and COP16 in Cali next month will be an opportunity to reaffirm this. Governance of the SRM technology, it's good to pause the different options that were provided by Artie earlier, and to discuss and have a more understanding of how this technology should be governed in the future. It's also important to gather and unite more groups, especially from the Global South, and take leadership in this initiative of calling for a non-use agreement. Also, we see that it's important to challenge the narrative of the positive impact of SRM. We might have to use the narrative of we might have to use the technology in the future is a bit of a fallacy, because we need to not have to use the technology, and the solutions as to not using it are already existing, and it doesn't, well, putting more effort in financing and those solutions are more viable than in the technology. And well, those financiers should shift their money and take more proactive actions. The idea of developing such technology gives room to continue polluting through over-industrialization is unjust to Africa and developing countries in general. Building national and regional commitment is important towards the establishment of a non-use agreement led by the Global South, as I said earlier, to demonstrate that there is no buy-in for experimentation and deployment. That would be all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Hiba, and thank you also for your leadership at the UNEA. That was a tough negotiation, and you were very articulate there. So thank you for that. I'd like to call on our next speaker now, and that is we're very fortunate and happy to have Felipe Maupai. I'm probably completely mangling that. But Maupai, he's the Deputy Head of Division, Geopolitics of Climate Change, Climate and Security, Water Diplomacy in the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. And he's going to tell us about Germany's position on solar radiation management. So, Felipe, the floor is yours, but we need to get you on screen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I will appear on screen as soon as I start talking. So
this is what has just happened. Great. Thank
perfect. You. Thank you. Thank you so much, Artie, and thank you very much to all the organizers of this session, also for allowing me to join this panel virtually to present the cross-government position of Germany on solar radiation management, and also would like to thank all the colleagues here in Germany who helped prepare this position. And just to tell you, this is really a work of all our ministries working together. Solar radiation management is not a topic only for the Foreign Ministry or only for the Ministry of Environment. We have at least 4 or 5 ministries, research, economics, and others that are involved in this topic. So we're still in the work of defining our position. So this is the current state of where we're at. So when government representatives are engaged in climate policies and they are asked to give an input on SRM, I think the first reaction is typically rather hesitant. And one of the reasons why they are so hesitant to cover SRM is that for us, the main focus lies on mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and on tackling the causes of climate changes, which is of the utmost importance. We now only have 6 years to have emissions, and SRM does not contribute to this endeavor at all and may even deter from it. So therefore, we should clarify first what we're talking about and when we're discussing SRM and future SRM governance options. So we should have 2 points in mind. First, notwithstanding the debates and initiatives in several international fora on SRM, and particularly on stratospheric aerosol injections, SRM proposals are far from being an option ready for deployment. Particularly the models projecting SRM interventions are far from reliably predicting the impacts and risks of SRM deployment, and there are many questions unanswered before global deployment could even be considered. Second, without any doubts, there is a need for improving international regulations and to address possible governance gaps. At the same time, we should not forget that there are some important international rules already in force, for example, through the Convention on Biodiversity. This means that new governance proposals should be cognizant of the existing rules and should not fall behind them. So first, global SRM deployment is not a feasible option at the moment. And second, there are some international rules existing that do have relevance for SRM. Therefore, SRM governance is not a matter we have to make hasty decisions upon in the next months. But nevertheless, we do agree that there is a need for anticipatory governance that does not only react on questions and challenges that are already at stake, but that sets a framework for possible future challenges that might come up. And especially when it comes to SRM, it seems wise to agree on some basic rules and principles in advance of any activities. So at first sight, the debate on the governance of SRM seems to be characterized by very heterogeneous understandings and proposals. This seems to be confirmed by the negotiations that took place at UNEA 6 this year in Nairobi, and they could not reach a consensus. But if we take a step back and look at SRM debates from a bird's eye view, we can also realize that there is considerable common ground, and many documents, studies, and initiatives on SRM highlight similar or even the same priorities. We detected at least 3 fundamental statements that are often repeated. One is about science, one is about multilateral governance, and one is about climate policy. The first common statement is that given the huge risks attached to SRM deployment, no hasty and scientifically premature deployment should take place. That is, there should be a sufficient scientific consensus on what will happen and what will be the risks. We therefore have included in our foreign climate policy strategy that Germany will, in accordance with the precautionary principle, continue to analyze and assess the extensive scientific, technological, political, social, and ethical risks and implications of SRM in the context of technology-neutral basic research and clearly distinguished from technology development for use at scale. Another very common statement is that no unilateral or rogue deployment should take place. That is, there should be sufficient international consultation and agreement within the community of states. The third common statement is that mitigation of climate change and the reduction of greenhouse gases is of utmost importance, and climate mitigation efforts must not be deterred by schemes for technical climate solutions that attract political, moral, financial, or technical resources. This shows that there is a considerable common ground and agreement that SRM must not be used at the moment. To our understanding, this is a basic non-use rule. This means that a basic non-use rule can be a bridge to finding common ground on conditions and concerns to be met regarding SRM. So we've shown some lines in a bigger picture, and we're cognizant that spelling out the details of such a basic common ground is another exercise. And as it is often the case, the devil may be in the details. So if we turn to the details, we put forward that there's already one international document that does spell out in some more detail a multilateral consensus on SRM, which is the moratorium under the Biodiversity Convention, the Decision 33 from 2010. Its wording underlines that no climate-related geoengineering activities may take place in the absence of science-based, global, transparent, and effective control and regulatory mechanisms, and without an adequate scientific basis. Moreover, the text of this decision establishes criteria for small-scale scientific experiments in controlled settings. As you may already know, Germany and the EU Commission, as well as the European Parliament, have confirmed this CBD decision. We believe that this text reflects the common ground we already do have and strikes a balance between those who hope or are convinced that SRM will never be an option and those who hope research will help to overcome the risks of SRM. We think that such a non-use provision ensures that those who might take decisions on SRM do think twice and do act in a precautionary manner. We are open for dialogues and discussions on a non-use agreement and moratorium on the deployment of solar radiation modification and large-scale outdoor experiments, and they should take the CBD moratorium as a starting point in order to strengthen and to operationalize it. It is on us to take responsibility and make the right decisions and change things for the better. And let's not forget, the one and only solution to the climate crisis is reducing greenhouse gas concentrations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. That was a very, very clear articulation of the interministerial position. So thank you for sharing that, very useful. I'd like to now introduce our third speaker. We're very fortunate to have you also here in person, Mr. Rio Hada, and he is the Chief Equality, Development and Rule of Law Section, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, here based in New York. So Mr. Harder is going to talk to us about solar geoengineering and its implications for human rights, another very crucial topic. You have to.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this forum. And I'm pleased to join my two fellow panelists. I feel a little bit lonely here, but you might as well. I want to contribute to this discussion from not just UN perspective, but from the human rights perspective of the United Nations. As you know, the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have been several resolutions on the interrelationship between environment protection and human rights. And importantly, 2 years ago, the UN adopted a historic resolution recognizing that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. And in doing so, they reaffirm that states have human rights obligations to prevent, to the greatest extent possible, the current and future negative impacts of climate. So clearly, the climate change action needs to be in line with these states' human rights obligations and commitments. And we also have in many reports of the IPCC that phasing out fossil fuels is imperative to mitigate climate change and minimize its future negative human rights impact on people. And that IPCC panel also found risks that can arise from certain responses that are intended to reduce climate change. In particular, implementing solar radiation modification techniques that introduces a wide range of new risks to people and ecosystems that are not well understood. However, so far, I will say that these new and emerging technologies intended for protection have not been extensively examined from human rights viewpoint. However, human rights laws, norms, and principles apply to any new technological development or application, including digital technologies and other areas, but particularly when it has the potential to produce large and long-lasting impacts on the enjoyment of human rights and on the environment. So last year, the Human Rights Council, that's the UN Human Rights Member States gathering, it has an advisory body, advisory committee. So the Human Rights Council asked the advisory committee to produce a report on the impact of new technologies intended for climate protection. in their enjoyment of human rights. And this was prepared and submitted to the council last year after consultations and inputs from stakeholders. And that report pointed out that because these new technologies intended for climate protection, including solar geoengineering, are meant to be applied on a global scale, they have the potential to affect everyone indiscriminately. They could seriously interfere with the enjoyment of human rights for millions of, perhaps billions of people. The magnitude of the potential negative socioeconomic and human rights impacts is currently incommensurable with any hypothetical benefits. So let me look at some of these potential impacts on specific rights. First, the right to life. Solar geoengineering, contrary to its aims, could potentially exacerbate the threats that climate change already pose to life, and hence the enjoyment of all human rights by present and future generations. Right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Solar geoengineering may potentially have negative or even catastrophic effects on weather patterns, biodiversity, and ecosystem as a whole. And also by diverting efforts and resources from the rapid phasing out of fossil fuels, as the two panelists have already talked about, it may have major effects on the environment, amounting to a violation of the right to a healthy environment. And that right includes the rights to clean air, safe and stable climate, access to safe water, adequate sanitation, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments in which to live, work, study, and play, and healthy biodiversity and ecosystems. The potential adverse environmental impacts will also affect economic and social rights, such as rights to food, water, and adequate standard of living, because of increased risk of food insecurity and diminished quality of life and opportunities for many people, particularly of those whose livelihood very much rely on natural resources. The testing and deployment of solar and geoengineering will also have implications on procedural rights, namely access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice and effective remedies. And there are also potential impacts on specific groups, women, children, persons with disabilities, who are systematically more affected by climate change. The way the climate action is performed will definitely be disproportionately affected and exposed to negative effects of geoengineering technologies, which will deepen intersectional discrimination. And such technologies would potentially have a disproportionate impact on indigenous peoples, whose traditional lands and territories are particularly exposed and at risk of experimental uses. And this may lead to forced displacement and deprivation of their lands, culture, and traditional livelihoods through changes in land use, agriculture, or weather patterns. The IPCC also pointed out that marginalized socioeconomic groups, such as migrants, people of color, descent, peasants, and other frontline communities may be particularly exposed to the negative impacts of these technologies. And they are also high risk because typically they tend to have a less say in the decisions that may affect the enjoyment of their rights. So looking forward, I'd like to make a few points. So from these considerations, and we have also heard arguments that we can draw a conclusion that deployment of solar geoengineering technology today would be contrary to the human rights and environmental legal frameworks. The full implementation of MEAs under the principles of international environment law is essential for the realization of the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and the whole of human rights. So we need to be clear, geoengineering does not address the root causes of climate change. We need to take action now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to strengthen and implement the commitments made under the Paris Agreement and the MEA. So this is my first point. Second, we need a strong global rights-based governance framework to safeguard people and the planet from the political, ethical, and security risks posed by any potential deployment of climate engineering. And lastly, it is a human rights imperative to ensure inclusive dialogues, transparent processes, and accountability and active participation of persons in decision-making processes related to potential climate engineering. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Also very important, also the report that you mentioned, highlighting the relationship between solar geoengineering, its consideration and human rights. So now we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So I'd like to open the floor. Any questions for our three panelists?
Lily Four with the Center for International Environmental Law. My question is for Philippe Montaille. I'm wondering if you could clarify for the, you said Germany is open to non-use, to negotiating an agreement on non-use of deployment and large-scale experiments. Can you clarify what that means for technology development, which is very different from any type of research? Do you hear me?
Yes, thank you. I hear you. Yeah, no, I think we're open to discussions on a non-use agreement, and I think what I wanted to highlight, I think one of the points I have made is that we're open to research, and we're trying to focus on the availability of having research that is not connected to any kind of deployment. That this is not excluded from our work. But what we would focus on a non-use agreement in the discussions is, of course, also non-use of any deployment. So we want to really separate any technology that allows the non-use, but we want to be able to research the risks of it.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Sorry, hi. I'm Anna Muller, and I work for the Global Challenges Foundation, one of the supporters of this event. And I have a question about this non-use agreement. If that were to take place, how do you see such an agreement look like, and how would that be governed and followed up? Or do you have any ideas of which body would be responsible for that? Would there be potentially an accountability mechanism for those states that would potentially break that agreement? Yeah, any elaboration on how such agreement could look like would be useful.
Thank you for that question, and also for your support for the session. Very much appreciated. Who would like to address that question? If anyone, it's an important one. I'm looking at online panelists. I don't know if you can see me looking at you, but
we can.
Would anyone like to take this?
We can, but I mean, an attempt to answer to this question, and I think maybe others are more know more on this. But I think the best option would be to put it under the United Nations, since it would be a common under to all the member states of the United Nations. So I think that's my 2 cents at this point. So it would be an ideal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiba. Philippe, did you want to add to that?
Thank you. Yeah, maybe just to come back. I mean, that's one of the big challenges, and I wish I had an easier answer for you. And that's one of the questions we're really thinking about. And there's pros and cons for many different fora. because there's many fields of info of impacts of SRM, and we should have, you know, many perspectives included. But just really, it's really hard to find the right forum. And if I always think of the non-proliferation treaty and say, okay, this is maybe the closest that we have, and still we're not able to implement it that for all the countries, and not everyone has signed to it. I think it's a big debate, and I think that's what we mean when we say, okay, we want to start the discussions. You know, we need events like this one to really bring the discussion forward. What would be the best forum? What are the bases we can do so? So for us, I think we're still very much open to the question, what would be the best forum? But I think, and I agree with the previous panelists, we really need an inclusive format that includes everyone on the global stage, and that does not exclude especially the most vulnerable members of the global community.
Thank you very much. Linda, did you want to say something on this question? And we have a number of other questions, please. There are mic. We don't really have a mic.
We don't, but if.
Oh, great. My name is Dam. I'm from Mongolia. And just this morning, first presentation, Professor made very clear that the GHG warm effect and the injected substances causing effect was different one. And but my question is, because of we are talking about the legal aspect, the human rights, and so on. And one man mentioned about cloud seeding exercise. It means not only this injected, but also in atmosphere nowadays we have enough concentration of aerosols, different kinds of aerosols. Also, seedling exercise also brought something in the atmosphere and so on. And when we develop a non-use agreement, it will be limited only by injected substances, or it will also take into account the outdoor human activities and also cloud seeding substances and so on. That's my question.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I guess it's a question about the kind of legal infrastructure we already have to address different types of pollution, and then also added to that intentional interjection of certain substances. But did somebody want to address that question from our panel? It's also, I think it perhaps goes to the point that Felipe was making about, you know, this is a political negotiation and a discussion about what should be the scope of a non-use agreement or a way to regulate solar geoengineering and sulfate aerosol injection, and what should fall under the purview of that, and how that's related to other forms of trying to address other forms of pollution. So I think that's a legal political question that I suppose needs to be, it's a political negotiation that needs to sort that out. That would be what anyone wants to add to that. Okay, I see some nodding, so yes, please.
Sorry, can I, my name is Yvette Ramos from the University of Lisbon. I'm doing a PhD at the present, and my topic is SRM governance. And we are curious to know about the patents already filed in the global scope of geoengineering, including SRM, including SAI. And so far, we found that there are many patents. So it's good to know and to understand the scope of this non-use agreement. One of the acts is don't file patents, but on the other side, there are already patents. So as you just said, we need to know exactly the scope, what is the legal instrument, especially when we know that filing patents is a tool to develop business. And you cannot just say, we won't file patents, because if it's a proper innovation with responding to align with different criteria, the national entity that protects the innovation will do so. So I ask you about, is there any patents, you know, and there is not so much research on that area. So what do you think about that? Like, it's very naive to pretend we want a non-use agreement and no file patents, when on the other side, there are already thousands of patents in geoengineering. So That's quite a big question mark, sorry.
Yes, thank you very much. Important question. I'm not sure if who that was exactly addressed to, but did some of our panelists want to say something about patterns in this space? Yes.
Sorry, Hiba, maybe you want to go first.
No, please go ahead. Oh, Deepa, please go ahead.
Okay, then I think I would like to use this to make, I think, a more general point, because when you were mentioning patterns and you said, okay, this is not known maybe by everyone in the discussion, I think that really underlines the point for transparency and the need for access to the information on what's being done. And I think one of the previous panelists also mentioned the question of financing. Not everyone knows where the financing for the different initiatives comes from. So really, in order to be able to make, an informed decision about the future and about the governments, we need to know what's already happening in the sphere of research and for SRM. And I think the question of patents is very important. And I would be very interested in having more research on that and to present, what's already been done in terms of patents. So thank you very much for raising this point.
Thank you, Philippe. Hiba, did you want to comment on that?
I mean, Philippe just mentioned exactly what I wanted to say, but it's true. We need a more thorough discussion on this and take a better study on the patents and finances, and have access. I think I mentioned in my presentation, have access in the existing information, and that is very key to that will enable us to have a better scope of the non-use agreement, as asked by the I don't know, the young lady or the lady who was there who mentioned it. I couldn't hear the name, sorry. But it's true. It's very important to see to what extent the non-use agreement would cover, and also the fact that if I did not hear properly the previous question, but I think it was mentioning that the solar geoengineering, the non-use agreement on solar geoengineering, would it cover cloud seeding and other geoengineering technologies? Is that it?
Yes, that was.
Okay. So I think at this point, well, we are taking baby steps, and it's always good to start with one of the most dangerous geoengineering technologies at this point that are very key. But maybe in the future and after the discussions on the solar geoengineering non-use agreement, it could also put in, and it's a good food for thoughts for this these discussions.
So
yes, absolutely. Thank you, Hiba. Please.
The more general points, we're talking about many researchers, and I agree with the point that Hiba made earlier, that this should not be just expert group, should not be just scientific, but also interdisciplinary. Eventually, we're talking about the impact on the environment, impact on human beings, right? So we need to look at the potential impact on human rights, environment. So we need to have that kind of impact assessment as part of the research. And secondly, I also wanted to say that when I talked about human rights obligations, of course, the human rights obligations is obligations of the states, the governments, but private sector businesses also have responsibilities to do no harm and respect human rights. So that we need to have that clear understanding on that responsibilities to do no harm by all actors.
Thank you very much. I see that we are out of time, so I just wanted to, just before I thank our speakers, I just wanted to say, I think it's really striking that we've heard 3 presentations, also government perspective, because it's not so often that we get to hear exactly, what what evolving government perspectives are. And it's striking that the focus has been on the precautionary principle, on human rights, on support for non-use. And I think that's telling, because the narrative is usually that non-use is a sort of radical extreme position. And the narrative in the media is that more and more people are contemplating this technology. But I think this has been very, very instructive for all of us here to hear where key governments are. The key governments in the African Union, in the European Union, and in the UN human rights establishment, and largely voicing support for, voicing severe concerns and support for non-use. So I just wanted to highlight that. And I think we're going to continue that discussion now in our next session, also to emphasize the point that whatever does exist is also largely restrictive, following on from what Felipe was saying about the CBD moratorium, etc. So, and also just highlighting the black box about the patent question and the funding question. These are things we really need to know. Where is this push for solar geoengineering coming from? And it's actually a very small group. The mainstream is of a different view. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists and give them a round of applause. For the late night interventions, which make your mind sharper, as it turns out. And I'd like to turn over to Karel Bardi, who is going to moderate the next session. So Karel, I'll leave it to you to introduce it. Thank you.
This is going to be our only full in-person session here. So I need a minute just to organize the chairs. This piece now. Oh yeah, maybe just put the I don't know. Can you change the and put it here? That would be nice. But maybe it's better not to put that, because then they can just see the camera bigger. Don't put that, because then the camera just opens. Yeah, exactly. I think that's better. This for the people that are online, then it looks like that, the whole room. So that's better for the people that are online. I see. For us, maybe not so nice, but you see us here, so. Right. But for the people that are online, that's better. Yeah. Okay. When we put it there, then they see everyone very small. So please bear with us. Leave his name there. And I can just I'll just perfect. That's easier. I hope our group of people online can hear as well. I think we can start. So thank you so much for everyone with us. This is a long session and we're coming and approaching the end. I'm Carol, as Arti introduced me. I am a researcher at the University of Münster, although I do my research and live in Brazil, and I'm from Brazil. And I'm here to introduce this panel now on the civil society, and with this wonderful set of panelists here, and I'm going to introduce everyone here by my side. So I have here by my side Panganga. Panganga is an indigenous mother from Sivunga, territory located in the so-called Bering Strait. She has been involved in many grassroots efforts seeking justice for indigenous peoples, including efforts to protect lands and water from extractive industry. including missing and murdered Indigenous relatives and domestic violence and sexual assault against Indigenous women. Social justice and healing are recurrent themes woven within Panganga's personal and professional life. Panganga is also a full spectrum Indigenous doula. And many years were spent developing and hosting communal healing spaces for historical trauma and colonial oppression. And most recently, Panganga began training as a tribal healer in the so-called Bering Strait region. And healing, justice, and advocacy continues in Panganga's role in the Indigenous Environmental Network as the climate geoengineering organizer. Next to Panganga, we have Lily Fuhr, the Director of Fossil Economy Program in the Center for International Environmental Law from Germany. Lily leads a team of dedicated attorneys and campaigners working to transform our economic system to urgently address the political, social, and economic realities of the tribal crisis of climate biodiversity and pollution by exposing the risks and impacts of false solutions, with particular attention to petrochemicals, agrochemicals, carbon capture and storage, and geoengineering technologies. Lily is a board member of the ETC Group and sits on the International Steering Committee for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And finally, my colleague and co-convener of this panel as well, Helene Brunfing, co-founder of the Mind Our Future, Critical Youth on Solar Geoengineering. Helene is from the Netherlands, but lives in Germany. She's the co-founder of this brilliant initiative, and her work focuses on engaging and connecting youth with the topic of solar geoengineering and the ongoing developments in research, policy, and civil society, areas that have seen significant progress with minimal critical youth awareness or input. She holds a master's degree in environmental sciences from Wageningen University. So this panel will proceed with 5-minute statements from our panelists. Then we'll engage in a few questions. We also take questions from the audience, and then we'll move on to our final speech, our conversation with Frank, where he will deliver our final talk of the day on the way forward on solar geoengineering governance debates. So, dear fellow panelists, if you'd like to start with your statements, is someone who'd like to start? Panganga, maybe would you like to start?
I'm just gonna go up here. Of course. So I can hide it. So I'm gonna call in a voice from the South since I'm from the North, just to give balance. Bentham Ohai is a great mentor. And he came up to Alaska and spoke to us. And one of the things he said was, what counts as knowledge? What knowledge counts? And who decides? He said, what counts as power? What power counts? And who decides? And so I ask you, what counts as solutions? What solutions count? And who decides? I'm from St. Lawrence Island, or Sikokak. And I'm going to share a little bit about the history of my island. In the 1800s, European whalers came and they decimated the whale population. And at the same time, Krakatoa erupted and caused a plume of sulfur dioxide that was so great, it caused 2 years of straight winter in Alaska. And the combination of these two things wiped out 99% of the population of our island. When the whales died, we died. That's how closely related we are to our ecosystem. We were also injected with radioactive iodine to see if human beings could survive longer in the cold. And our beautiful island was used as a dumping ground for fuel, heavy metal solvents by the military. These forever chemicals bioaccumulate in our animal relatives. We are so closely tied to our ecosystem that as our lands, waters, and animal relatives are contaminated, we too become contaminated and killed. Our island is located in one of 2 thoroughways to the north. The world's toxics bore from the fossil fuel industries and their byproducts travel through our island through wind and water currents as toxics are attracted to the north. We have been used as both the stepping stool and dumping ground of science in Western society. So I carry this history with me into my work with geoengineering. The idea of trying to alter Earth systems in a controlled manner is a violation of the sacred. Everything that's in balance in relationship to each other. Trying to control or alter this balance violates the sacred relationships and sacred balance of Mother Earth, Father Sky, and now even Grandmother Moon. I am reminded of my colleague, Aklasia Bamasuk, who said, as a society, we have forgotten how to be in relationship with one another. Indeed, colonization, patriarchy, white supremacy, militarism, and capitalism, and an extraction-based economy have stolen this from us. All of these unnatural ways of being work together to sustain each other. Climate solutions are not preventing sea ice loss or reflecting sunlight. We do not address climate change by treating our land and waters as carbon sinks or building man-made structures to sequester carbon. These narrowly focus on the symptoms of climate change, leading to a cycle of running to the next emergency, attempting mitigation, not meeting the threshold, and then starting all over. Focusing on mitigation and not the root cause, like the burning of fossil fuels, is a deadly compromise we cannot afford. True and sustainable solutions do not lie in a university or laboratory, but in relationship with your community, local organizations, and the Indigenous peoples on whose land you reside. Geoengineers and their proponents believe wholeheartedly that there is a global interest in geoengineering. In the neo-colonial tradition, much like a modern-day manifest destiny, they believe their values, knowledge, and experience overrule those of Indigenous peoples on whose lands and waters they would like to proceed with testing and implementation. This flawed thinking is the same that has led us to where we are today. Geoengineering and its testing is unsafe, theoretical, and diverts billions in resources from real solutions, and is in direct conflict with Indigenous values. To test these technologies effectively, you would have to implement them, and implementing these technologies is a form of experimentation. It is a scandal to make this decision to do so for what one culture perceives to be the greater good. Even small-scale testing causes harm to local ecosystems and vulnerable populations. We must consider the militarization of such technologies and the implications of how this would be applied in order to target certain populations. As an Indigenous femme, I understand that with new infrastructure comes man camps and more missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. We must not assume that these would mitigate anything at all and consider that there would be more likely a compounded negative impact. When looking at climate policy, we must revisit the values which founded the creation and structure of the proposed policies. If we continue operating as though one value system and one way of being is the only standard in which to live, we will continually struggle with our ability to live in balance on a livable and thriving Mother Earth. Of course, all technologies that lead to carbon credits mean that fossil fuel companies increase their caps and governments meet net zero targets while rights violations by fossil fuel industry continue. It means there are increased cancer, lung disease, and accidents in communities who live near refineries. The use of carbon market, cap and trade, carbon credits offsets, biodiversity offsets does not reduce emissions at source. Many of these projects rely on the use of such offsets and market-based mechanisms to generate revenue for their projects, like make sunsets. And we know that this is not only a land grab, but an ocean grab. Using land and now animal relatives such as whales as carbon offsets allows fossil fuel companies to escape accountability, continues the legacy of colonialism and extraction. It all works together. Indigenous nations, and that's what we are, nations, find ourselves fighting for what is referred to the right to free, prior, and informed consent. We are fighting for the floor. That's not the standard. The issue is that we are only asked to give consent after both the problem and the solution have been identified by those who are not in direct relationship with the ecosystems in question. We have been in relationship with these ecosystems for time immemorial. Our people predict weather patterns simply by looking at the sky. We know what is happening in the ocean based on our observations of how healthy or unhealthy our animal relatives are. We know our environment, so why are you talking to us 10 steps after the fact?
stop finding funding for projects to address the symptoms of climate change and talk to us, because the symptoms are not the problem. We not only have the right to consent to do things that are done to us, we have the right to direct our own solutions. We have the right to decide.
Thank you, Panganga. Very honored to be speaking after you. So I'll speak for my organization, the Center for International Environmental Law, but I also sit on the steering committee of the Hands Off Mother Earth Alliance, together with Panganga and others in the room here. So I'll also speak a little bit to what we're doing as part of the International Home Alliance, the only civil society network alliance that is really dedicated to resisting and opposing geoengineering. And I have 3 points, what it looks like to be in opposition to geoengineering as civil society. And my first point is maybe the most important one, because we're often hearing there are very few who are actually speaking out and who are opposing these technologies. And that is not true. We're not alone. We're actually many, we're loud, we're clear, we're organized, and we stand together. So the Hands of Mother Earth Alliance is there. But we also work as part of a wider civil society ecosystem. So HOME has been, some of our HOME members are members of the Climate Action Network International, which is the largest network in the climate ecosystem, almost 2,000 members, and for many years now, has had a very clear position against solar geoengineering and has voiced that repeatedly. There are initiatives and networks like Demand Climate Justice, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, the Alliance for Non-Governmental Radical Use, the Climate Land Ambition Rights Alliance, Real Zero Europe, and so many more in civil society who have taken a very clear stance against solar geoengineering or even against geoengineering altogether, and are voicing that. And it is wrong to assume that this is a marginalized voice. It is actually the majority of civil society that clearly stands against geoengineering. And actually over 2,000 organizations have endorsed the solar geoengineering non-use agreement, the academic initiative. So that's really my first point. And then the second point is that a lot of the work that we've been doing collectively over the years has been campaigning against outdoor experiments. I think we've talked a lot about governance here, and I want to just shed a bit more light on outdoor experiments, because when we talk about research, the fight really and the conversation is not so much about what people do in their, on their computers, in their labs, in their heads and on paper. It is, the question is what happens in the real world when these ideas become reality and we move into outdoor and field experimentation. And the Home Alliance, with many, many allies, has been for many years resisting solar geoengineering outdoor experiments. One was already mentioned quite a bit, the Scopax experiment, where Harvard University proposed an experimental flight to test their equipment over Sami Indigenous territory in Sweden, which received a lot of opposition and pressure. The flight never happened, and the research project eventually closed down just recently. There was also a marine cloud brightening experiment that was starting in Alameda City in California, that was put on hold through a city council vote following really major opposition and criticism from civil society, but also local residents. And we're looking at a picture where we're facing a lot more outdoor experiments going forward. Panganga already referred to Make Sunset, a startup company that is selling cooling credits in the US and sending balloons into the stratosphere. We've seen the UK government announce a major public research project funded with public money that is looking into outdoor experiments in the UK. And we have also heard and will be hearing more about an Israeli company called Stardust that is looking at commercial scale stratospheric aerosol injection. And these probably won't be the last ones. So we're seeing really a proliferation of outdoor experiments. And we will continue to resist those and oppose those. And that brings me to my third and last point. A lot of our work as civil society has been happening in international fora and in advocacy for restrictive governance and protection of existing restrictive regulations that we have. So the CBD decision has been referenced many, many times here in this conversation today, which makes me really, really happy. I think it's really important. So many have noted that before, but the last couple of years, we've really seen a concerning proliferation of these outdoor experiments that are really in violation of that experiment. So what we're looking at right now is that the upcoming CBD COP in Cali in Colombia presents a really good opportunity, and there's some language in some documents that were discussed at the subsidiary body earlier this year that could really provide an opportunity to reinforce once again and reconfirm that existing de facto global moratorium. The United Nations Environment Assembly discussion was referenced. I think that was a major milestone for really advocacy for, for precaution and for protection of the governance that we have and resisting efforts to undermine that. And we've also seen, like all of the additional momentum that was mentioned with Mexico's announcement to ban solar geoengineering experiment and deployment on their territory, the AMSEN decision, the African decision, an EU parliamentary resolution from 2023. And we were really excited to hear the statement at the Summit of the Future by the co-chair from Namibia, who really warned against the dangers of geoengineering. So there's a lot happening, and civil society will continue to stand together, and the opposition is really growing. And I really want to leave to really make sure to explain that even though we have very little capacity to see a lot of sort of campaigning in the field right now from civil society, because there's very little funding and very little capacity to do so, the opposition is strong and growing, and we will continue to do so from the very local level, from the outdoor experiments all the way to international fora across the board. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lily, for that. So Carol introduced me already. I'm Helene, and I am the co-founder of Mind Our Future, Critical Youth on Solar Geoengineering, SRM. And we are a student-led initiative, and we are focused on engaging youth on critical conversations on the topic, and then specifically stratospheric aerosol injection. So if I think about it, it's crazy that we are sitting here today talking 4 hours about SRM. Because the first time I learned about geoengineering was during my bachelor's in environmental sciences a few years ago. And there was just one slide at the very end of the lecture showing proposals of both SRM and CDR. And I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind thinking, no way these things will ever happen. No way we are seriously going to consider or pursue this. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong, because we are sitting here today with growing research, funding, and attention to these ideas, and SRM, as we have heard today, already making it into climate conversations. So today, I'm deeply honored to represent a group of people who are often overheard, excluded in these conversations on SRM, representing the perspective of my fellow students, some of which are online, who share my concerns. So our generation grew up confronted with the dire state of our planet. And for us, the climate crisis has never been a distant issue, relevant for when we are turned old. But it has always been an urgent reality. So we learn about the long history of failed international efforts to cut emissions by the generations before us, was already facing climate impacts today and projections that tell us that the impacts will only get worse once we get older, if not catastrophic. So for many young people like myself, these worries have resulted in a feeling of anxiety, which I believe many of us here share today. But luckily, not only anxiety, because many young people, my fellow students, also have a deep desire to act and do something more than just stand by and watch this crisis unfold. And it brings me to SRM, because I think no matter your perspective on SRM, these feelings of a sense of desperation and a desire to do something is something we all share. Where we may differ is whether one views SRM as part of the solution or as part of the problem. Those who see a role for SRM keep telling us it could slow or even reverse global warming, and promise us that this technology may buy us time to reduce the necessary emissions. And I must admit, it sounds appealing. However, as I learned more over the years about SRM, this idea of a temporary fix has only increased my feelings of desperation, which I know is shared by many fellow students. So perhaps our biggest concern is that SRM becomes a distraction from what we know is urgently needed, which all of our speakers, I guess, mentioned is cutting emissions. So even those most optimistic about SRM would agree with us, and they say, yes, of course, mitigation should come first, but we ask ourselves, will it? Once there will be this promise of an easy way out. And our generation has been promised time and time again that our efforts should focus on cutting emissions. So let me ask you, how is that going? So the risk that SRM will become yet another convenient excuse for delay seems extremely high to us, leaving our generations and future ones with an ever larger carbon debt to clean up. So those pushing and advocating for this technology can promise us now again that it will not or should not become yet another distraction. But how can they be so confident? Who is going to live up to that promise? The same generations and institutions that promised us to cut the necessary emissions. So what we need you to do is to live up to the previous promises that have been made to my generation. We don't need a quick fix. We want you to focus on proven solutions that address the root causes of the climate crisis. We need countries, especially rich global north countries, who seem to be pushing this SRM debate, to step up, take responsibility, and pay their climate debt. And to keep us on that path, it makes it more urgent than ever that also conversations or any decision on SRM and its research include the perspectives of those who aren't blinded by short-term interests. The perspectives of those most vulnerable, including youth, who stand to lose the most. And this brings me back to where I started, this desire to act for a safer future. And I get that for some, SRM might seem like a fast and maybe cheap way to act on a warming planet. And it's understandable to want such an easy way out and avoid doing the hard work. But please ask yourself, for my generation, are you willing to gamble with the future of our planet, the lives of mine and future generations, for the sake of a quick, cheap, yet unproven and risky fix? While there are proven technologies, which we know that work, and most importantly, that address the root causes of the climate crisis. So in the end, it will be my generation that will live to see the consequences of our actions today. So for those pushing and advocating for SRM and future research, I urge you to mind our future. Thank you.
Such brilliant statements. We could easily stop here, but I think we can continue this panel and also hear a bit more about our panelists. The first question that I have for you today is on this note is that these advocates of geoengineering research specifically, they often articulate their motivation in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, right? That's what they say. So how do you normally respond to that claim? I think Elaine already started drawing a bit upon that, but if you would like to expand on that, then please go ahead. Whoever would like to go first.
So some geoengineering projects such as the Real Ice Project. It's not solar radiation, but you'll see right on their website, this is just a perfect example. They say that Indigenous peoples are going to be the ones who will most benefit. And they're even offering for us to keep the carbon credits for the use of the technology. But they haven't had a conversation with us. And so generally, even if they say they're speaking on behalf of or hoping to benefit Indigenous peoples, they haven't spoken to us. And if they haven't given us all of the information for us to make an informed ethical decision.
I would say we've heard a lot from voices from the Global South here today, actually. We've had a very clear view on this topic, and I have not heard any one of them ask for more research and outdoor experiments and development of technology. Quite the opposite. And we've actually heard similar voices from countries, governments representing communities and citizens in climate vulnerable countries. In the CBD, in UNEA, it's very clear what they demand is to say no to this very dangerous techno fix, because they're very aware of the risks and dangers. And I think just because we're desperate, I think Raymond Pihamba or someone said that already, just because we're desperate, it doesn't turn a bad idea suddenly into a good idea. And I think just, these unpredictable regional impacts and risks that came through in the science panel earlier today. The one thing I would add to that, yes, volcano eruptions, they can cool the planet, but they can also cause famines, right? And the moral hazard argument, I'm personally really getting tired of having conversations where people say that, of course, mitigation has to come first. Well, just because we say, it has to come first doesn't mean it will. Like, we cannot talk this mitigation moral hazard away. It is a real thing because we live in a world of unequal power dimensions and relationships. Arti Gupta has made that very clear. So we need to consider that reality around us. So that makes it very difficult, but it certainly doesn't change the fundamental need to say no to this very dangerous technology.
Do you want to add to that? Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I keep it short. I simply don't buy that claim that it's in the interest of my generation, because it's simply not. Like, I don't get it. I believe it's a justification of their own interests. So yeah, that's fine.
Thanks. Another possible claim is that you've all, of course, expressed critical views of geoengineering. And we have heard in a few presentations that there are some NGOs and youth groups who are advocating, if not for deployment yet, for at least for research and a seat at the table in decision making, right? What is your perspective on how widespread these different perspectives are in the movement?
I still say that they don't have all of the information, and when they do, their views change drastically. Once they know that outdoor experiments are already happening, that Indigenous rights are being overlooked, and once they learn how it's linked to the carbon market, and once they learn of the devastating impacts that are shown by even their own computer simulations showing the famine and the drought and the monsoon cycle disruption, everything, like once they learn about it, they're not. And I don't come across a lot of people who are for it.
I would echo that. I don't come across a lot of organizations and groups, and I earlier went through the list of civil society networks, alliances, coalitions, etc., which is very, very wide, and we're talking about, way more than 2,000 groups all across the world who voiced a very clear stance and position against solar geoengineering. I think what we're running into is an effect that we're also seeing on the academic side, where the question is whose expertise counts, right? If you're inviting geoengineering experts into a conversation, there is the risk that you're going to invite those who are researching and wanting to develop those technologies, because they are the ones who pay to spend money on that topic. You're not likely going to invite, the Indigenous farmer who probably has a lot more relevant expertise to bring that to that conversation, but they're not considered an expert in that field. And I think in civil society, there's a handful of groups who have dedicated capacity to bring forward the conversation, around development and research into geoengineering technologies, and they tend to have a very loud voice because they get invited into these conversations. And the over 2,000 groups I reference, they tend to not all get invited into these conversations because they don't they have a clear position on this, but don't advocate for it, so their voice is not heard.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, as Lily said, like these groups are very, very small at the moment, and I think they are mainly funded by those who are pushing this technology, and there is simply no funding for those other voices, or at least they don't. Like it's not SRM advocates. Like nobody wants to do this. And you mentioned like there's this one group who says like young people should be sitting at the table. Yeah, of course they should. But what I feel like what happens with young people in this space is that they are becoming instrumentalized for the sake of other people's ideas. And I think that's something we should be very, very careful about, that like those who tends to have this SRM open conversations and dialogues, we have to think about, okay, but who is funding these young initiatives? So
are they asking to join the table, or are they asked to join? Are they being asked to join the table, being funded by interests?
Exactly. And I think there are examples of this, like with the Overshoot Commission, like just to make the conversation more diverse and as if they are open for more perspectives, but simply they are there to, now the youth is included. So yeah, I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, this topic of funding and the disparity in funding on this topic came across basically in all the panels, right? Academic panel, the governance panel, and now on the civil society panel. So of course, the issue on power dynamics and how this relates to.
Can I share one more point?
Yes, of course.
So I have a history, and our community has a history of organizing against mining industry, against fossil fuels, all of it linked back to colonialism, racism, and the techniques that are used by the proponents of geoengineers are so similar to those used by the mining industry. And often it is uplifting and paying the voices within those vulnerable populations and within civil society to say like, hey, see, there's people who are, in favor of it. And this is, and they'll even, we had opposition against this company called Arctic Ice Project, and one of their suggested solutions to the opposition was to tokenize essentially an Indigenous person and place them on their board, and that would like silence any opposition for
the whole community. We are running a bit out of the time, and I want to be mindful of everyone who's been sitting here from the beginning for 4 hours. So we finish on time. So maybe we see if we have any questions from our audience to our panelists. Otherwise, we move on, and I move on to my final question and closing comments. Oh, that's really respectful of everyone. It's really nice. I hope you're not very tired, but if not, we're approaching the end. So with this, then we move to our final question and closing comments, which is what is your perspective as civil society leaders envisaging a roadmap for the solar geoengineering governance in terms of global institution and agreements, since we've heard from the academic perspective and also from the perspective of the governments, of the global institutions. As civil society, what is your perspective on the governance now? Please go ahead.
I have some stuff written down. So I just wrote a list of what is needed
from my perspective. So one thing is to hold universities and private funders who allow these projects to move forward without prior and informed consent, hold them accountable. There needs to be an international grievance mechanism for Indigenous peoples, because as of now, when we've asked what we can do, we're told that we have to rely on our own governments to back us up when these outdoor experiments happen without our consent. Hold, of course, fossil fuel companies accountable for escaping accountability. They have to reduce emissions at source, allow Indigenous peoples to conduct their own environmental impact statements with adequate funding for training without any strings attached, change public funding structures so research funding goes directly to Indigenous communities, frontline communities, and any others that are directly impacted by colonialism and racism, so universities and researchers can apply to work under our guidance and direction if we choose to conduct our work with them. And then we also need transparency. So when the public is informed about what geoengineering is, they're informed about what it really is and where it fits within the colonial structure, and it's given in context. And the reality is it's just a swan song of an already dying industry, and it's like the last lifeline for the fossil fuel industry.
So, no question on that. So what I hope is that more young people will raise their voice against the risks of SRM. And I would also invite everybody to join Mind Our Future, like the initiative we have. And then I would hope that young people make clear to their governments that SRM is not a way forward and nothing you can make young people happy with. And I hope young people will call for restrictive governance on these very risky technologies.
So on that roadmap, I was just thinking of the Oasis song Wonderwall. So I think all the, the road is very winding and the lights are blinding, and that leads us there. I think that's very true. But I think there's a concrete roadmap that we can map out, but need to take steps to follow. So right now, we still need to do a lot of work to protect the restrictive governance that we have, including in the CDD. There are opportunities to expand that. For example, in the context of the London Protocol and London Convention, which regulates, dumping of matter at sea, has banned ocean fertilization and is looking at additional marine geoengineering technologies to including potentially a marine solar geoengineering technology, potentially. We really need to prevent outdoor experiments that would undermine existing obligations, laws, and principles, including AFPIC. We need to prevent public funding from going in that direction. That means really looking at what the UK, for example, is doing right now, which is moving in the wrong direction. We need to definitely prevent commercialization. So just mentioning again, like Sunsets as a company, Stardust as a company, and really looking forward. I mean, I'm just really inspired with what we've heard here today from, from delegates, government representatives, colleagues in the Pacific and Africa, what they've mentioned from Latin America, European signals. I'm just really excited to see some of the next steps that would move us in the direction of non-use going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, and thank you so much for everyone also for the audience. I can do this thing. So now to our last speaker, Professor Frank Bierman from Utrecht University. Should I read Frank's bio? Yeah, I can do that.
Good. Thank you so much, Carol. Thanks for the fantastic panels, fantastic presentations we had. So I was asked a little bit to wrap it up in a kind of spontaneous fashion. And also that was one of the secret assignments to link it a bit to the meeting where many of us have participated, which is the Summit of the Future. And the discussions also about the SDGs, which is actually my own research project also. So I'm here in New York, in particular to observe the discussions on the SDGs and on the Summit of the Futures. And I want to bring it all a bit together. And I think one thing that was really running through the discussion that we had in the last couple of days in New York in the SDGs, of course, the focus on the SDGs 1 and 2, the eradication of poverty, the ending of hunger, the strong focus on the vulnerable, the strong focus on equality, the strong focus on justice that is running through the entire UN activities. And to me, SRM is the opposite. I mean, to me, the discussions of solar geoengineering is the opposite of that. And we heard the presentations of Ray, we heard also the presentations of civil society and also of governments to some extent about the risk that solar geoengineering is bringing. We heard about the statement of Vanuatu in particular, which was very strong on these points, and the statement of the president of Namibia yesterday in the General Assembly, who said, it was already mentioned, but I quoted verbatim, he said that we must harness the incredible advancement in technology for the common good, while being ever vigilant against the misuse of innovation, such as, and then he followed this geoengineering. So it was a strong statement in the General Assembly against geoengineering by the president of Namibia. And I think therefore one important lesson of these discussions is that whatever the discussions are, and these discussions will go on, the global south must be in the driving seat. I think that's very important, and that's totally lost out in many of the discussions we have in other panels and other discussions. I think it's very important to bring in, we are talking here about technologies for planetary interventions. We're talking about technologies that can change the entire planet. And therefore, I think it's extremely important to bring in the entire global community, especially the global south. It's not only a problem with unilateral deployment, I think also unilateral research and unilateral development of these technologies is unacceptable. And we need to have strong controls on all the research and technology development discussions and developments that we have right now. And we heard very strongly from the group of African countries and also from the delegation of Vanuatu that they are very clear in their restrictive and precautionary focus on solar geoengineering and calling for a non-use. And the other points, of course, strong in the entire UN system. We heard about the last couple of days. It's a strong focus on climate. SDG 13, generally the climate discussions. And here, you hear quite often from those who are proposing solar geoengineering, that solar geoengineering could be a help, a rescue in the climate crisis. They could rescue the Paris Agreement. And my personal position on these matters is, I see it as the opposite. I believe that solar geoengineering, not only the deployment, but already discussions, the hypothetical development of SRM in the future would eventually lead to the collapse of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement has a clear temperature target of 1.5 or 2 degrees. That's very clear. So there is a risk in a sense that what happens at some point when some actors in the fossil fuel industry and other corporate sectors would realize that there is another way of achieving the 1.5. This could lead, I'm afraid that's one of my biggest fears in these matters, that this could create harmful incentives for some actors to reduce their ambitions on the NDCs. So that at some point you have a process in the stocktake process under the Paris Agreement that countries will have less ambitious, less demanding or later NDCs. They will not talk about 2050, they will talk about 2060, they talk about 2070, because there's another way out there in some labs and some scientific papers that 1.5 could also be created differently. And that would lead in a global interdependence that we have to a race to the bottom. A race to the bottom, and I'm afraid that this will eventually lead to an effective, almost a replacement of the Paris Agreement by geoengineering fantasies and maybe even to a collapse of the Paris Agreement over time. And that would create, and this is what was laid out by Ray to some extent, to a totally different world. A world with high greenhouse gas concentrations masked by continuous, and Ray said about thousands of years, or it's maybe whatever, but hundreds of generations would be active, needed to have an SNM process in place. And I think that is a very likely risk in the current discussion. That's one of the reasons that I kind of engaged in these discussions. I mean, it's not my main research area, but this is one reason why I enter these debates, because I'm very, very concerned about the survival of the Paris Agreement. I see it threatened by the debates on geoengineering. And then coming to global governance, it was mentioned by a variety of speakers from governments, but also from the academic community, Professor Gupta and others. They spoke about it. And here, I'm looking at global governance for 30 years, in a sense, the entire sustainability or also other areas of governance. We are talking here about planetary management. We're talking about the need to govern a process of managing and changing the entire planetary system. And for that, we do not have any existing governance mechanisms. I mean, for those of you who have been at the New York meeting right now, the discussions, you can just spend half a day in the General Assembly or half a day in any of the meeting rooms in the UN building. This organization, with all due respect, I mean, they're fantastic people working there. I don't want to criticize them, but the entire system is not in a position to govern a process such as planetary geoengineering. It's not able. You can just go to one of these meetings and imagine, should these people in these meetings govern geoengineering? I believe it's just plain impossible. Compliance control is very important in these matters also. I mean, you would need a system where some global actor would control non-compliance with geoengineering schemes. And we don't have any system in place to deal with these issues. Geoengineering could be used as a weapon. It could be weaponized. And that is not, I mean, it means that thousands of airplanes are flying around the planet and are changing the climate in a sense and trying to do all kinds of things that are very difficult to control. How would the major powers react to this? Would the United States ever accept control by other countries? Would Russia ever allow the Americans to fly over the territory with geoengineering programs under the current geopolitical situation? And we can also imagine what other geopolitical situations we might have in the future. So therefore, I believe that the governance systems are not in place, and they're especially not in place to protect the interest of the global south. And this is probably also what drives the discussions in the African countries and in Vanuatu and Fiji and others, that there is a feeling and a fear, and I think it's very justified, that the control about these technologies will always be kept by actors in the global north. And there will never be any share. We have clear historical evidence. I just mentioned COVID vaccinations, where technologies were held by the global north and never be shared by the global south. Who would make us believe that this would be different for such powerful technologies such as geoengineering? And for all of these reasons, I think it's also very important. That's all the reasons that I believe have motivated also the powerful position that we heard today of African countries, a group of African countries, and also Vanuatu and Fiji. And I was very struck by the link that Vanuatu seems to make with ecocide. I mean, I've looked at ecocide discussions for quite some time. It's a very interesting discussions, as of course not materialized yet, but ecocide has been defined by some scholars as the unlawful acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread and long-term damage to the environment caused by these acts. And that has been linked by Vanuatu with solar geoengineering. I think it's a very, very powerful, very interesting, and very strong movement in a sense to link geoengineering with the crime, international crime of ecocide as it's been discussed. Generally, for all of these reasons together, I mean, I was asked also for the way forward. The way forward is these discussions are not going away, because we know there are communities who are supporting the dialogue on geoengineering. There's lots of money from philanthropic foundations flowing into these debates. So therefore, they will not go away. So it means that the discussions need to be taken on, and also that everybody has to come up with positions. Countries have to come up with positions, and we have heard from Africa and from Germany also, and from Vanuatu, that they are working on these kind of positions. Civil society needs to take positions, and I can just report, as has been mentioned already, that 2,000 civil society organizations have supported the non-use agreement, which I think is a very strong statement. And from those academics who have organized this extremely strong sense of support, very important for us that we have all the support. So we're very grateful for the support. But also for researchers, I mean, it's also the question, of course, what does it mean for researchers? There are some researchers who object solar radiation management and its research and development. These are 550 scholars who have signed the non-use agreement. But for all the others, the question is, can you invest in research and development of solar geoengineering technologies in light of the opposition that we have heard from the group of African countries, in light of opposition from Vanuatu? Is it really ethically legitimate to research these technologies when so many countries in the global south are so vividly and so loudly speaking out against the technologies. I think that's a very important ethical discussion for the research community. And so I hope, I mean, in terms of the way forward, that these discussions also among countries continue. And listening to Vanuatu, listening to the position of the African countries, listening to the position of Germany as well, and also many European countries that share the position of Germany, I would not be surprised that at some point these countries would share their views, because they have spoken out quite clearly against geoengineering with different nuances here and there. Germany is a bit more on the research side, so I could not be surprised. I would not be surprised to see at some point an international initiative by these countries moving together in a UN setting, in the General Assembly and other meetings to push forward a non-use agreement. But that's kind of my personal expectation, that this is not impossible. So I think that is what I would also personally, of course, appreciate. Good, but I just talking too much. I can see already the views from the chairs. And thank you so much. Good.
Thank you very much, Frank. You could never talk too much, so that's absolutely. No, your remarks are very, very welcome. And thank you for giving us those reflections, also linking back to some of the discussions that have been happening at the Summit of the Future about the SDGs, etc. I know that our energy is flagging. This has been a very long session, but very, very useful and important. So I think we'll skip any Q&A. We'll bring this to a conclusion. I think unless anyone has a burning remark or comment or something you'd like to share with us, yes, please.
My name is Pangwina Taiwari. I'm Banganga's auntie. I've been a community researcher for 22 years. We have had our own community-based project on Sivoka, which is our traditional name for St. Lawrence Island. Due to Cold War era former bases on our island, and also we do research on persistent organic pollutants or POPs. And now we know that the Arctic Ocean has the most microplastics of all the oceans. And time is running out for my people. We're in a climate crisis. My people have 4 to 10 times higher PCBs than the average American in the lower 48. Our traditional food is so loaded with PCBs from POPs at levels we should not be eating it for excess cancer risk. We're seeing species die off in our fish, birds, seals, and whales, and our existence as Sivoka people. You know, this is environmental violence, environmental racism, where we're being contaminated without our consent from POPs, from military contamination, from microplastics. And now this false solution that is threatening our existence. And the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the globe. Our freezers are empty because there's no ice. The polar ice cap has not come down in 50, 70 years. The marine mammals my people rely on and have for centuries. If there's no ice, our freezers are empty. So I call on you to listen to my niece's story, but also what I'm sharing, because time is running out for our existence. And we need civil society to bring awareness of what is happening to the Arctic. So I am grateful for this opportunity, just briefly to share my view, but I am so honored and proud of my niece. You know, we all have health harms in our families. My family, we were a family of 8, my parents and siblings. I lost 3 family members to cancer. I'm a cancer survivor, and I've had 3 miscarriages. We all have family in Alaska that are dying of cancer, but also years and years of ecological grief of what is happening to our lands, airs, and waters. Now there's more and more research to mental health harms linked to chemical exposures, and on and on and on. But we suit up and show up because we need voices like my niece here to bring awareness of what is happening, the genocide, and other burdens we didn't create. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Can I just say, thank you for having these conversations? Because usually as an Indigenous person, I'm usually the only one in the room saying that solar is not a solution to climate change because we are still extracting from my people's lands. And it is not going to be. I just want to say thank you so much because we should continue having more of these conversations.
Thank you very much for being in those rooms and for continually raising your voice. And thank you so much for that powerful intervention. And I think this is the perfect moment and the perfect thing to end on. And I just wanted to maybe just make one closing remark, which is, I think that this is exactly what we are hearing for those who are promoting this idea of SRM and who are suggesting that they just want to enhance the global conversation, bring in more voices. The question for us is, is refusal taken seriously? Is refusal a possibility? And who gets to refuse? And I think that is a very important question that has come up. Millie pointed it out that there is a clear message coming, but is anybody interested in listening to that clear message? If it doesn't say what those who are posing the question, want to hear. And I think that is where Chuck's, I thought, ended his talk very powerfully. He said, people are telling us what is good for us. And we are trying to articulate what our view is, and that is somehow dismissed. So I think the question is, not only who gets a seat at the table to say yes, but also whose no is actually taken seriously. I think that is very important because the deliberation community, the SRM deliberation community will continue to deliberate until they get the answer they want to hear. Because if they're in the room and they hear the answer, no, we don't want that, somehow that answer doesn't land. And so the deliberation and inclusion process needs to continue, and resources need to be invested in that, when in fact the message is so loud and clear. So I think that on that note, I would like to thank all of you for being here, for sharing your views, for listening so patiently to all of our speakers and moderators and panelists, for also being here, engaging with each other. It's been very, very fruitful, very informative. I want to thank our online participants as well. I think this conversation, it's very fortunate that we have this virtual technology and we can reach with our, with our panel, etc., these messages to others who are not here physically in New York. There are a lot of people online, as I understand it. So we are very grateful for them for having stayed the course. I think this session is recorded, so you can share this message with others. And hopefully, if somebody wasn't able to make it, you can watch back. But with that, I'd like to thank again our supporters, the Global Challenges Foundation, without which this would not be possible, because it's very expensive real estate in New York City, and somebody needs to pay for that. So thank you so much to Global Challenges Foundation, but also to the Heinrich Böll Foundation and to Friends of the Earth, capacity constraints, financial constraints, but putting what few resources we have out there to bring this important message to the broader community. So thank you so much, everybody, to my co-conveners, organizers, Frank, Carl, and particularly Helene, who has worked so hard to organize this session. So we are so grateful, Helene, and I should also note that it's Helene's birthday today. Point out that she is still a member of the youth, so still on that side of the age boundary, wherever that is. Of course, we're all young at heart, we're all in some sense. But happy birthday to Helene. Thank you so much, and for fighting the good fight, and we're all here to continue it for future generations, of course. So thank you very much.